The rain falls softly against the windows tonight, just as it did that autumn evening in 1987, when Eleanor Blackwood first set foot in the coastal town of Millhaven. The gentle patter of droplets creates a rhythm that seems to whisper secrets from the past, secrets that have remained buried beneath the rocky shores of this New England fishing village for over 3 decades. Our story tonight takes us to a place where the lighthouse beam cuts through the darkness, where fishing boats bob peacefully in the harbor, and where the sound of seagulls mingles with the eternal crash of waves against weathered stone. It's a story about disappearances and discoveries, about the thin line between truth and mystery, and about how sometimes the most profound secrets are hidden in the most ordinary places. As you settle into your bed tonight, let the sound of rain transport you to Millhaven, a town of weathered shingles and salt-stained windows, where everyone knows everyone, and where one woman's arrival would change everything forever. Close your eyes and imagine the lighthouse beam sweeping across the water, steady and reliable, just as it had been for over a century, until the night it suddenly went dark. This is the story of Eleanor Blackwood, the lighthouse keeper who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that have never been answered and mysteries that continue to echo through the fog-shrouded streets of Millhaven to this day. Millhaven sits nestled between granite cliffs in the restless Atlantic, a town that time seems to have touched gently. In 1987, it was home to just over 800 souls, most of whom could trace their families back 3 or 4 generations to the original fishing families who had settled there in the 1800s. The town moved to the rhythm of the tides, with lobster boats heading out before dawn and returning as the sun painted the harbor golden. Main Street curved like a smile along the water's edge, lined with buildings that had weathered countless storms. Thompson's General Store stood at the corner of Harbor Road, its wooden floors creaking with the footsteps of generations. The Anchor Inn, with its cozy dining room and crackling fireplace, served as the town's unofficial meeting place, where fishermen shared stories over steaming bowls of clam chowder and visitors marveled at the authentic charm of a genuine New England fishing village. The lighthouse stood sentinel on Beacon Point, a white tower that rose 93 feet above the rocky shore. Built in 1892, it had guided countless vessels safely through the treacherous waters that surrounded the point, where underwater ledges and hidden rocks had claimed more than their share of ships over the years. The keeper's house, a modest 2-story structure painted the same crisp white as the tower, sat connected to the lighthouse by a covered walkway that protected the keeper from the harsh winter storms that regularly battered the coast. For nearly a century, the position of lighthouse keeper had been passed down through the Morrison family. Old Thomas Morrison had tended the light for 47 years, followed by his son William, who had served for 32 years before his own son Robert took over in 1965. It was a tradition, a calling that seemed to run in their blood like the salt water that surrounded their isolated home. But in the spring of 1987, Robert Morrison made an announcement that shocked the town. At 58 years old, he was retiring early, citing health concerns and a desire to move closer to his daughter in Portland. The Coast Guard, which by then had automated most lighthouses along the coast, had planned to automate Millhaven Light as well. However, the town council, recognizing the lighthouse's importance not just as a navigational aid, but as a symbol of the town's maritime heritage, successfully petitioned to keep a keeper on staff. The search for Robert Morrison's replacement began in earnest that summer, with applications coming from as far away as California. Most applicants were men with maritime experience, former Coast Guard personnel, or others who had worked around boats and navigation their entire lives, which made Eleanor Blackwood's application all the more surprising. Eleanor arrived in Millhaven on a gray September morning, driving a well-maintained but modest sedan loaded with boxes and suitcases. She was 34 years old, with auburn hair that caught the light and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with careful attention. She wore practical clothes, wool sweaters, sturdy boots, and rain jackets that spoke of someone who understood coastal weather. What struck the townspeople most about Eleanor wasn't just that she was a woman applying for what had always been a man's job, but that she seemed to possess an unusual combination of sophistication and practicality. She spoke with the educated accent of someone who had attended good schools, yet she clearly understood the mechanical systems that kept the lighthouse operational. During her interview with the town council, she demonstrated an impressive knowledge of maritime navigation, weather patterns, and the maintenance requirements of both the lighthouse equipment and the historic building itself. Her references were impeccable. She had worked for the National Park Service, maintaining historic lighthouses along the California coast. Before that, she had served in the Coast Guard for 6 years, specializing in navigation and communications. Her supervisor in California described her as exceptionally competent, reliable, and dedicated to the preservation of maritime heritage. The Coast Guard confirmed her service record and noted her commendations for excellence in duty. Yet there was something mysterious about Eleanor's decision to leave her position in California for the isolation of Mill Haven. Light, when asked during her interview why she wanted the job, she had smiled and said simply, "I've always been drawn to the sea, and I believe in the importance of maintaining these historic structures." Mill Haven Light has a reputation for being one of the finest examples of late 19th century lighthouse architecture on the East Coast. Town Council member Margaret Chun later recalled being impressed by Eleanor's knowledge, but puzzled by her reticence about her personal life. She answered every technical question perfectly, Margaret would tell investigators years later. But when we asked about family, about what brought her to Maine, she kept her answers very brief. Professional but private, you might say. The council voted unanimously to offer Eleanor the position, partly because she was by far the most qualified candidate, and partly because they were running out of time. The lighthouse needed to be occupied before winter, and Robert Morrison was eager to complete his move to Portland. Eleanor accepted the position immediately and moved into the keeper's house in early October. She brought with her an impressive personal library focusing on maritime history, New England genealogy, and lighthouse preservation. Her furniture was sparse but elegant, a few carefully chosen pieces that suggested both good taste and a preference for simplicity. The townspeople were naturally curious about their new lighthouse keeper. Sarah Walsh, who ran the post office, noted that Eleanor received very little personal mail, mostly professional journals and correspondence from historical societies. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store, remarked on her extensive knowledge of maintenance and repair work. She knew more about those old mechanical systems than most men who'd been working on them their whole lives, he would later recall. Eleanor settled into her duties with remarkable efficiency. The lighthouse and keeper's house had been somewhat neglected during Robert Morrison's final years, as his arthritis had made it difficult for him to keep up with all the maintenance requirements. Eleanor spent her first months systematically restoring both buildings to pristine condition. She proved to be meticulous in her record keeping, documenting weather conditions, vessel traffic, and equipment maintenance with the thoroughness of someone who understood the historical importance of such records. Her logs, written in neat, precise handwriting, noted everything from the arrival of migrating birds to the subtle changes in tidal patterns that marked the transition from autumn to winter. The townspeople found Eleanor to be friendly but reserved. She shopped at Thompson's General Store twice a week, always polite and pleasant with Martha Thompson, but never lingering to chat. She occasionally ate dinner at the Anchor Inn, usually bringing a book and sitting at the corner table by the window, where she could watch the harbor. The staff found her courteous and appreciative, but she rarely engaged in the casual conversation that was the lifeblood of small-town social interaction. Dr. James Hartwell Millhaven's only physician met Eleanor when she came to his office for a routine checkup required by her employment. He found her to be in excellent health, both physically and mentally. She struck me as someone who was very self-contained, he would later reflect. Intelligent, obviously well-educated, but carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had learned to be completely self-reliant. Eleanor's daily routine quickly became as predictable as the lighthouse beam itself. She rose before dawn to check the light and record weather observations. She spent mornings on maintenance tasks, methodically working through a schedule that ensured every piece of equipment received regular attention. Afternoons were often devoted to historical research, and she could frequently be seen at the town library, studying old shipping records and lighthouse logs dating back to the 1890s. Library volunteer Helen Curtis remembered Eleanor's research with particular clarity. She was fascinated by the early years of the lighthouse, especially the first keeper and his family. She spent hours going through the old town records, birth certificates, death records, anything that might tell her more about the people who had lived in that house before her. Asterisk, as autumn turned to winter, Eleanor's presence in Millhaven began to reveal some unusual aspects. Town clerk Betty Morrison Roberts' cousin noticed that Eleanor never received any personal visitors. No family members came to see how she was settling in. No friends made the trip from California to visit her in her new home. For someone who had made such a significant life change, moving clear across the country to a remote lighthouse, Eleanor seemed remarkably isolated. More intriguing still were the questions she asked during her historical research. While she claimed to be interested in lighthouse preservation and maritime history in general, her inquiry seemed increasingly focused on specific families and specific time periods. She asked repeatedly about the Blackwood family, claiming they were distant relatives she was trying to trace. The librarian, Mrs. Patricia Donnelly, helped her search through genealogical records, but found only limited references to Blackwoods in the area. There had been a Blackwood family in Millhaven in the early 1900s, but they had left town sometime around 1920 under circumstances that weren't entirely clear from the available records. Eleanor seemed particularly interested in this period, requesting to see newspaper archives from 1918 to 1925, though the library's collection from those years was incomplete. Eleanor's interest in local history might have been unremarkable, except for the intensity with which she pursued certain lines of inquiry. She asked about property records, about families who had left town suddenly, about any unusual incidents or disappearances in the early decades of the century. Her questions were always phrased casually, as the natural curiosity of someone new to the community, but Mrs. Donnelly began to sense a deeper purpose behind the inquiries. As winter deepened, Eleanor's evening routine became a source of fascination for the few townspeople who lived within sight of the lighthouse. Every night, after the light was operational and her official duties complete, Eleanor could be seen walking the rocky shoreline around Beacon Point. Even in harsh weather, she maintained this habit, bundled in a heavy coat and moving carefully. Among the tide pools and rocky outcroppings, Thomas Chun, Margaret's husband and a lifelong Millhaven resident, often watched Eleanor's evening walks from his window. She wasn't just getting exercise, he would later tell investigators. She was searching for something. She moved like someone who had lost something precious and was determined to find it. She'd stop at certain spots, sometimes for long minutes, just staring at the rocks or the water. Eleanor's historical research took on new dimensions as winter progressed. She had gained access to the lighthouse's own historical records, logs and documents that had been stored in the keeper's house for decades. These papers, some dating back to the lighthouse's construction, provided a detailed picture of daily life at Beacon Point. Among these documents, Eleanor discovered something that seemed to energize her research efforts dramatically. Mrs. Donnelly noticed the change immediately when Eleanor arrived at the library the morning after spending an entire night reading through the lighthouse archives. She was different that day, Mrs. Donnelly would recall. More focused, more urgent. She asked to see very specific documents, property deeds, court records, anything related to the Blackwood family's departure from Millhaven. She said she had found a reference in the lighthouse logs that she needed to follow up on. Eleanor's research revealed that in 1919, the original lighthouse keeper, Thomas Morrison, grandfather of the Robert Morrison, who had recently retired, had made several unusual entries in his official log. These entries, written in the careful script required of all lighthouse keepers, mentioned irregular activities around Beacon Point and concerns about the safety of the light. More significantly, the logs indicated that in September 1919, a member of the Blackwood family, a young woman named Catherine Blackwood, had approached Keeper Morrison with what she called urgent information about threats to the lighthouse. The logs noted several meetings between Catherine Blackwood and Keeper Morrison, but provided no details about the nature of her concerns. The final entry about Catherine Blackwood was dated October 15, 1919, and was unusually brief for Morrison's typically detailed logs. CB has not returned as scheduled. Family reports she has departed for Boston. Matter closed. Eleanor cross-referenced this information with town records and discovered several troubling inconsistencies. There was no record of Catherine Blackwood purchasing train tickets to Boston. More significantly, her name appeared on no further official documents, no marriage records, no death certificates, no employment records in Boston or anywhere else. It was as if Catherine Blackwood had simply vanished from all official existence after that October day in 1919, asterisk as winter storms battered Millhaven Light. Eleanor's evening walks continued with an intensity that began to concern some townspeople. Deputy Sheriff Michael Warren, making his monthly check on the lighthouse during a particularly severe February storm, found Eleanor on the rocks despite weather conditions that had driven even the hardiest fishermen indoors. She was soaked through, Deputy Warren would later report. Standing on those rocks in sleet and 40-mile-an-hour winds, just staring out at the water. When I called to her, she seemed almost surprised to see me, like she'd been lost in thought or memory. I insisted on escorting her back to the house. During the walk back to the keeper's house, Eleanor had been unusually talkative, perhaps due to the adrenaline of the storm or simply the need for human contact after hours of solitary searching. She mentioned her research into the Blackwood family and expressed frustration at the gaps in the historical record. She said something that stayed with me, Deputy Warren recalled. She said, sometimes the most important stories are the ones that someone tried very hard to erase. When I asked what she meant, she just smiled and changed the subject. Eleanor's research had indeed uncovered evidence that someone had made deliberate efforts to remove traces of the Blackwood family from Millhaven's historical record. Certain pages had been carefully cut from bound volumes of town meeting minutes. Property records showed inconsistencies that suggested documents had been removed or altered. Even more tellingly, Eleanor discovered that several residents who had lived in Millhaven during the 1910s and 1920s had given conflicting accounts about the Blackwood family in various interviews and documents over the years. The most significant discovery came when Eleanor gained access to the personal papers of old Thomas Morrison, the lighthouse keeper from 1919. These papers, stored in the basement of the Morrison family home and forgotten for decades, contained Morrison's private notes about his official duties. Unlike his formal lighthouse logs, these personal notes revealed Morrison's growing concern about Catherine Blackwood and the information she claimed to possess. Asterisk, according to Morrison's private notes, Catherine Blackwood had discovered evidence of deliberate efforts to sabotage the lighthouse. She claimed to have witnessed someone tampering with the light mechanism and had documented a pattern of suspicious activities around Beacon Point. Morrison had initially been skeptical, but Catherine's evidence convinced him that there was indeed a serious threat to the lighthouse's operation. More disturbing still, Morrison's notes indicated that Catherine Blackwood feared for her personal safety. She had told Morrison that certain prominent members of the community were involved in activities that required the lighthouse to be unreliable on specific nights. When Morrison pressed her for details, Catherine had promised to provide documentation that would prove her claims. The final entry in Morrison's private notes, dated the day after Catherine Blackwood's disappearance, was brief but chilling. CB failed to have promised evidence. Searched usual places, no sign. Fear the worst but dare not speak without proof. Have secured the light. Will maintain vigilance. Asterisk as winter gave way to spring, Eleanor's research took on new urgency. She had pieced together a disturbing picture of corruption and cover-up in Millhaven's past, but she still lacked definitive proof of what had happened to Catherine Blackwood. The historical record suggested that Catherine had stumbled upon something significant enough to warrant her disappearance, and that someone with considerable influence had worked to erase all traces of both Catherine and whatever she had discovered. Eleanor's evening searches of the rocky shoreline intensified with the arrival of spring tides, which exposed areas of the coast that remained underwater during much of the year. Local fishermen began to comment on the lighthouse keeper's obsessive attention to the tide pools and rocky crevices around Beacon Point. Captain Frank Delacroix, whose lobster boat passed close to the lighthouse every morning, noticed Eleanor's systematic searching pattern. She wasn't just walking, he would later tell investigators. She was conducting a methodical search of every inch of shoreline. She had some kind of system. I'd see her marking things on a map, taking photographs, even taking samples of seaweed and sand. Eleanor's behavior might have remained merely eccentric, if not for her growing tendency to ask pointed questions about specific families and their activities during the 1910s and 1920s. These questions, always couched in terms of historical interest, began to make certain longtime residents uncomfortable. Town historian James Fletcher, whose grandfather had been the mayor of Millhaven in 1919, found Eleanor's inquiries particularly unsettling. She asked very specific questions about my grandfather's administration, about decisions regarding the lighthouse, about contracts for maintenance and supplies. She seemed to know more about that period than anyone had a right to know. Eleanor had indeed uncovered evidence of irregularities in the town's handling of lighthouse-related contracts during the 1910s. Her research suggested a pattern of inflated invoices, substandard materials, and deliberate scheduling of maintenance that would render the light unreliable during specific time periods. Most significantly, she had found evidence linking these irregularities to the same time periods when Catherine Blackwood claimed to have witnessed suspicious activities around the lighthouse. Eleanor's breakthrough came in late May during one of the year's lowest tides. Working systematically through a section of the rocky shore that was rarely exposed, she discovered something that had been hidden for nearly 70 years, wedged deep in a crevice between two large boulders, protected from tides and weather. By its position, Eleanor found a leather satchel that had somehow survived decades of storms and salt spray. The satchel contained papers that Catherine Blackwood had carefully wrapped in oilcloth before hiding them in what she must have hoped would be a secure location. The papers documented a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of Millhaven's government and business community. Catherine Blackwood had uncovered evidence that certain town officials and prominent citizens were deliberately sabotaging the lighthouse to facilitate smuggling operations. By ensuring that the light was unreliable on specific nights, they could guide ships carrying illegal cargo to hidden landing spots along the coast. The documents included photographs of the sabotage equipment, detailed records of ships and cargo, and most damning of all, correspondence between the conspirators discussing their operations and their concern about Catherine's investigation. The final letter in the collection, dated October 14th, 1919, one day before Catherine's disappearance, was brief and ominous. The Blackwood girl knows too much. The situation must be resolved permanently. Eleanor spent several days studying the documents and cross-referencing them with her other research. The evidence was compelling and complete, finally explaining both Catherine Blackwood's disappearance and the systematic effort to erase all record of her existence. The conspiracy had involved some of the most respected families in Millhaven, people whose descendants still lived in the town and whose names were on streets, buildings, and monuments throughout the community. Armed with this evidence, Eleanor faced a dilemma that Catherine Blackwood had never had the chance to resolve. The documents proved that Catherine had been murdered for her investigation, but they also revealed that the conspiracy had involved people whose families remained influential in Millhaven. Simply turning the evidence over to local authorities might result in another cover-up, or worse, might put Eleanor in the same danger that had claimed Catherine's life. Eleanor spent the first weeks of June developing a careful plan. She made copies of all the documents and stored them in multiple secure locations. She researched the current status of the families involved in the original conspiracy, identifying which descendants remained in Millhaven and what positions of influence they held. Most significantly, she began documenting her own research and conclusions, creating a complete record of her investigation that could serve as insurance against any attempt to suppress the truth. During this period, Eleanor's behavior became noticeably more cautious. She varied her daily routines, avoided being alone with certain townspeople, and began making regular phone calls to contacts outside of Millhaven. Town postal clerk Sarah Walsh noticed that Eleanor had begun sending weekly registered letters to an address in Boston, always using her personal account rather than official lighthouse business. Eleanor also began reaching out to law enforcement agencies outside of the local jurisdiction. She contacted the Maine State Police, the FBI, and several maritime law enforcement agencies, establishing contacts who could investigate the case independently if necessary. However, she was careful not to reveal the full extent of her discoveries until she could be certain of a thorough and impartial investigation. As summer progressed, Eleanor's research and her questions about Millhaven's history began to create noticeable tension within the community. Several longtime residents complained to the town council that the lighthouse keeper was stirring up old troubles, and suggested that her historical interests were inappropriate for someone in her position. Town council member James Fletcher, grandson of the mayor who had been implicated in Catherine Blackwood's documents, was particularly vocal in his criticism. "We hired her to maintain the lighthouse, not to dig up ancient gossip about respected families," he complained during a July town council meeting. "Some stories are better left buried." Eleanor was not present at that meeting, but word of Fletcher's comments reached her quickly through the town's efficient gossip network. The comment about stories being better left buried particularly disturbed Eleanor, as it echoed language from some of the conspiracy documents she had discovered. Deputy Sheriff Warren noticed Eleanor's increasing wariness during his monthly visits to the lighthouse. She had always been reserved, but by midsummer she seemed actively suspicious. "She asked me directly whether I thought the local police could be trusted to investigate historical crimes impartially. When I asked why she was asking, she said she was just curious about how such things were handled." Eleanor's evening walks continued, but she now carried a camera and took extensive photographs of the rocky shoreline. She also began leaving detailed notes about her daily activities and discoveries, notes that she mailed regularly to her contact in Boston. These precautions suggested that Eleanor was aware of potential danger, but was determined to continue her investigation despite the risks. In August, Eleanor made one final discovery that completed the picture of what had happened to Catherine Blackwood in 1919. Working through the lighthouse's original construction records, she found evidence that a section of the foundation had been rebuilt. In late 1919, just weeks after Catherine's disappearance, the work had been done quickly and quietly, With no official permits or town approval. Ground-penetrating radar equipment, borrowed from a maritime archaeology contact in Boston, revealed an anomaly in the area where the foundation work had been completed. The readings suggested that something had been buried during the construction process, something that remained undisturbed beneath the lighthouse foundation. Eleanor documented this discovery carefully, but she did not attempt to investigate further. Instead, she prepared a comprehensive report that included all of her findings, from the original conspiracy documents to the evidence suggesting Catherine Blackwood's final resting place. She arranged for this report to be delivered to multiple law enforcement agencies simultaneously, ensuring that any attempt to suppress the investigation would be immediately apparent. On August 28, 1987, Eleanor completed her final lighthouse log entry. The entry was routine in its documentation of weather conditions and vessel traffic, but it concluded with an unusual personal note: have completed research into the history of this position. The truth about past events will soon be revealed. The light must continue to serve its purpose faithfully, as it has for nearly a century. That evening, Eleanor followed her usual routine of checking the lighthouse equipment and securing the building for the night. She prepared a simple dinner and spent several hours reading in the keeper's house living room, just as she had done hundreds of nights before. The night that would change everything began like any other late summer evening in Millhaven. A gentle fog rolled in from the Atlantic as the sun set, nothing unusual for the season, but thick enough that the lighthouse beam would be particularly important for any vessels navigating the coastal waters. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds, perfect conditions for the late-season tourists who still visited Millhaven in the final weeks of summer. Eleanor completed her evening inspection of the lighthouse mechanism at 8:47 p.m., recording the time in her log as she had done every night for nearly 11 months. The light was functioning perfectly, its powerful beam cutting through the fog. With the steady rhythm that mariners had relied upon for 95 years. The backup generators were tested and ready, the radio equipment was operational, and all safety systems were working normally. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Eleanor was seen by Thomas Chun walking along the rocky shore near Beacon Point, following the path she had traced so many times during her months of searching. Chun, taking his evening walk with his dog, waved to Eleanor from a distance. She waved back, appearing relaxed and unhurried in her familiar evening routine. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Eleanor Blackwood. At 11:43 p.m., Captain Frank Delacroix was returning from a late fishing run when he noticed something that had never happened in his 37 years of navigating Millhaven's waters. The lighthouse beam had stopped working. The massive lamp, which should have been visible for miles even in the thickening fog, was completely dark. Delacroix immediately attempted to radio the lighthouse, using the emergency channel that Eleanor monitored around the clock. His calls went unanswered. Growing concerned, he radioed the Coast Guard station and the Millhaven harbor master, reporting the lighthouse failure and requesting immediate investigation. Harbor Master Paul Richards responded within minutes, departing the town dock in his patrol boat despite the challenging fog conditions. Richards had been harbor master for 12 years and had never experienced a complete lighthouse failure. Even during power outages, the backup generators should have maintained the beacon's operation. Richards reached Beacon Point at approximately 12:20 a.m. on August 30th. The lighthouse was completely dark, and the keeper's house showed no signs of activity. Richards used his boat's searchlight to illuminate the shoreline and called repeatedly for Eleanor through his loudhailer system. He received no response. Unable to safely approach the rocky shoreline in his boat due to fog and tidal conditions. Richards radioed for land-based assistance. Deputy Sheriff Warren responded, along with volunteer firefighter Tom Bradley and several other townspeople who had heard the radio traffic on their emergency scanners. Warren reached the lighthouse. At approximately 1 a.m., using the access road that connected Beacon Point to the main town, he found the keeper's house unlocked, with all the lights off but no signs of disturbance. Eleanor's evening dinner dishes were washed and put away. Her reading chair showed the impression of recent use, and a book lay open on the side table. As if she had just stepped away, the lighthouse itself presented a more puzzling picture. The massive lens and lamp assembly were undamaged, and Warren could find no mechanical problems that would account for the light's failure. However, the main electrical panel had been deliberately shut down, with several critical switches moved to the off position. This was not a malfunction. Someone had intentionally disabled the lighthouse. Warren immediately called for additional assistance and began a systematic search of the keeper's house. Eleanor's personal belongings appeared undisturbed. Her bed had not been slept in, but this was not unusual given that it was still relatively early in the evening when she had last been seen. Her outdoor clothing and equipment were missing, consistent with her having taken her usual evening walk. By 2:30 a.m., a full search operation was underway. Local volunteers, organized by Fire Chief Robert Donnelly, began systematically combing the rocky shoreline around Beacon Point. The fog complicated their efforts, but they used flashlights and portable floodlights to examine every accessible part of the coast. The search focused initially on the area where Eleanor was known to conduct her evening walks. The rocky shore around the lighthouse was treacherous, even in daylight, with tide pools, loose stones, and hidden crevices that could easily cause a fall. In fog and darkness, even someone familiar with the terrain could have a serious accident. However, the search teams found no evidence of an accident. Eleanor's usual walking route showed no signs of disturbance, no clothing or equipment that might have been lost in a fall, and no blood or other indications of injury. The tide pools and rocky areas that would have been most dangerous were thoroughly examined, but yielded no clues to Eleanor's whereabouts. At dawn, Harbor Master Richards was able to conduct a water-based search of the areas around Beacon Point that were inaccessible from land. Using his boat's sonar equipment, he methodically surveyed the underwater ledges and rocky areas where someone might have fallen. This search also produced no results. State Police Detective Sarah Martinez arrived in Millhaven at 8 a.m. on August 30, responding to Deputy Warren's request for assistance with what was now classified as a missing person case. Detective Martinez had extensive experience with coastal disappearances and understood both the urgency of finding Eleanor and the challenges posed by Millhaven's geography. Martinez immediately secured the lighthouse and keeper's house as potential crime scenes, though initial evidence suggested that Eleanor had left voluntarily for her evening walk. The detectives' first interviews were with the townspeople who had seen Eleanor on August 29th, establishing a timeline of her final day. Eleanor had followed her usual routine throughout the day. She had shopped at Thompson's General Store in the morning, purchasing supplies for the lighthouse and exchanging pleasantries with Martha Thompson. She had spent the afternoon working on lighthouse maintenance, tasks that were observed by several fishermen who passed near Beacon Point. She had appeared normal and unhurried in all these interactions. The discovery that someone had deliberately disabled the lighthouse added a troubling dimension to the case. Detective Martinez quickly determined that the electrical shutoff required specific knowledge of the lighthouse's systems. This was not random vandalism. Whoever had disabled the light knew exactly which switches to operate and in what sequence. Thorough search of Eleanor's personal belongings revealed several items of significant interest. In her desk, Detective Martinez found Eleanor's complete research files about the Blackwood family and the 1919 conspiracy. The detective also discovered copies of the documents Eleanor had found hidden in the rocks, along with Eleanor's own analysis and conclusions about Catherine Blackwood's disappearance. Most significantly, Martinez found evidence that Eleanor had been preparing for possible danger. Hidden in various locations throughout the keeper's house were multiple copies of her research. along with detailed instructions for contacts outside Millhaven who should be notified if anything happened to her. These precautions suggested that Eleanor had been aware of potential threats to her safety. Eleanor's personal calendar showed appointments with several law enforcement agencies in Boston for early September, meetings where she had planned to present her historical findings formally. Her telephone records indicated frequent calls to these agencies throughout August, calls that had apparently been related to arranging these meetings. Detective Martinez also found Eleanor's personal journal, which provided insight into her state of mind during her final weeks in Millhaven. The journal entries revealed Eleanor's growing certainty that she had solved a 70-year-old murder case, but also her increasing concern about potential retaliation from people whose families might be implicated in her discoveries. One crucial item was notably absent from Eleanor's research materials: the original documents that Catherine Blackwood had hidden in 1919. Eleanor's notes indicated that she had discovered these papers in May, but Detective Martinez could find no trace of the original documents anywhere in the keeper's house or lighthouse. This absence was particularly significant because Eleanor's notes indicated that the original documents contained evidence that would be legally admissible in a criminal investigation. Without these documents, Eleanor's research remained historically interesting but legally insufficient to pursue charges related to Catherine Blackwood's death or the 1919 conspiracy. Detective Martinez theorized that Eleanor might have hidden the original documents in a secure location, just as Catherine Blackwood had done nearly 70 years earlier. However, a comprehensive search of the lighthouse property failed to locate any hidden materials. The detective began to consider the possibility that someone else had gained access to the documents, possibly through coercion or theft. News of Eleanor's disappearance sent shockwaves through Millhaven's close-knit community. The lighthouse had never failed in living memory, and the idea that someone had deliberately disabled it was deeply disturbing to residents whose lives and livelihoods depended on safe navigation of coastal waters. However, the community's response was complicated by the nature of Eleanor's historical research. Some residents, particularly those from families that had been prominent in Millhaven for generations, expressed discomfort with the attention being focused on events from the 1910s and 1920s. Town Council member James Fletcher publicly questioned whether Eleanor's obsession with ancient history might have contributed to her disappearance. Other residents rallied to support the search efforts, organizing volunteer teams and providing local knowledge that might help investigators understand what had happened. Local fishermen shared their expertise about tidal patterns, weather conditions, and the treacherous underwater geography around Beacon Point, the Maine state. Police expanded the investigation beyond Millhaven, contacting Eleanor's former colleagues in California and her contacts in various law enforcement agencies. These inquiries confirmed that Eleanor had been preparing to present evidence of historical crimes to federal authorities, but they provided no additional clues about her current whereabouts. By September 2nd, the FBI had become involved in the Eleanor Blackwood case, primarily due to the potential federal maritime law violations suggested by her research. Agent Patricia Molina arrived in Millhaven to coordinate with state and local authorities and to investigate the broader implications of Eleanor's historical discoveries. Agent Molina's review of Eleanor's research confirmed that, if accurate, her findings documented a significant conspiracy that had endangered maritime navigation and potentially resulted in multiple deaths over several years. The deliberate sabotage of lighthouse equipment was a federal crime regardless of when it had occurred, and the evidence suggested that the conspiracy had operated for at least 5 years during the late 1910s and early 1920s. The federal investigation brought additional resources to bear on both Eleanor's disappearance and the historical crimes she had uncovered. Agent Molina arranged for forensic examination of the lighthouse foundation, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques to investigate the anomaly that Eleanor had discovered beneath the building. Asterisk. On September 8, 1987, federal investigators made a discovery that transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a potential homicide. Careful excavation of the area beneath the lighthouse foundation revealed human remains that had been buried there for approximately 70 years. The remains were consistent with those of a young woman, and personal effects found with the body confirmed that this was Catherine Blackwood. Catherine's remains told a story of violence that confirmed Eleanor's worst suspicions about the events of 1919. Forensic examination revealed that Catherine had died from blunt force trauma to the head, injuries consistent with deliberate assault rather than accidental death. The location of the burial, beneath what had been a construction site in late 1919, strongly suggested that her death had been planned and covered up by people with access to the lighthouse renovation project. More significantly, items buried with Catherine included the original documents that had formed the basis of Eleanor's research. These papers, protected by the same oilcloth wrapping that Catherine had used, provided definitive proof of the conspiracy that had cost Catherine her life. The documents were in remarkable condition considering their age, and forensic analysis confirmed their authenticity. The discovery of Catherine Blackwood's remains vindicated Eleanor's research completely, but it also raised troubling new questions about Eleanor's own disappearance. If Eleanor had known about Catherine's burial location, and her research notes suggested that she had, why hadn't she reported it to authorities? And if someone had wanted to prevent Eleanor from revealing this information, what lengths might they have gone to in order to stop her? Asterisk. The federal investigation expanded to include a comprehensive review of Millhaven's current residents and their family connections to the 1919 conspiracy. Agent Molina discovered that several families implicated in Eleanor's research still had members living in the town, including some who held positions of local authority. James Fletcher, the town council member who had been most vocal in criticizing Eleanor's historical research, was the grandson of Mayor Fletcher, who had been identified in Catherine's documents as one of the conspiracy's leaders. Thomas Morrison, the current harbor master's uncle, was the son of the lighthouse keeper who had been coerced into participating in the sabotage operations. Several other prominent families had similar connections to the historical conspiracy. However, family connections alone did not constitute evidence of involvement in Eleanor's disappearance. Agent Molina needed to establish whether any of these individuals had known about Eleanor's discoveries and whether they had taken action to prevent her from revealing them. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had not been as discreet about her research as she had believed. Her frequent visits to the library, her questions about specific families, and her obvious interest in the 1919 time period had created considerable discussion within Millhaven's interconnected community. Several witnesses confirmed that Eleanor's research had been a topic of conversation at the Anchor Inn, Thompson's General Store, and other local gathering places throughout the summer of 1987. Asterisk. Reconstruction of Eleanor's final weeks revealed several incidents that, in retrospect, suggested growing tension between Eleanor and certain members of the community. In early August, Eleanor had complained to Deputy Warren that someone had been on the lighthouse property at night, leaving footprints around the keeper's house and disturbing her research materials. Eleanor had also reported receiving several anonymous phone calls during her final month in Millhaven. The calls consisted of heavy breathing or silence, but they occurred frequently enough that Eleanor had begun documenting them in her journal. Her final journal entries expressed growing concern that she was being watched and that someone was trying to intimidate her into abandoning her research. Most significantly, Eleanor had confided to librarian Patricia Donnelly that she believed someone had attempted to break into the keeper's house while she was away. Eleanor had found subtle signs of disturbance papers slightly out of place, Furniture moved imperceptibly that suggested someone had searched her home looking for specific items. These warning signs painted a picture of escalating harassment that culminated in Eleanor's disappearance. Agent Molina theorized that Eleanor had been targeted by someone who knew about her research and was determined to prevent her from revealing her discoveries to federal authorities. Asterisk, by September 15, 1987, the Eleanor Blackwood case had attracted the attention of multiple federal agencies. The FBI's investigation was joined by the Coast Guard, which had jurisdiction over maritime crimes, and the National Park Service, which oversaw the preservation of historic lighthouses. This multi-agency task force brought unprecedented resources to bear on what had become both a current missing person case and a decades-old murder investigation. The task force established its headquarters in the Millhaven Town Hall, transforming the usually quiet building into a bustling center of investigative activity. Agent Molina coordinated the overall investigation while Coast Guard investigators focused on maritime aspects of the case and park. Service personnel provided expertise on lighthouse operations and preservation. The investigation's scope expanded beyond Eleanor's disappearance to include a comprehensive review of maritime incidents along the Maine coast during the 1910s and 1920s. Preliminary research suggested that the conspiracy Eleanor had uncovered might have been responsible for multiple shipwrecks and disappearances during its years of operation. Historical maritime records revealed a disturbing pattern of vessels that had encountered difficulties in the waters around Millhaven during the time period when the lighthouse was being deliberately sabotaged. Several ships had reported confusion about the lighthouse signal, and at least 3 vessels had been wrecked on the rocky ledges around Beacon Point during nights when the light should have been operational, but apparently was not. Asterisk, the task force implemented a covert surveillance operation targeting the current residents of Millhaven who had family connections to the 1919 conspiracy. This operation, coordinated by FBI counterintelligence specialists, monitored phone calls, mail, and personal movements of several individuals who might have been involved in Eleanor's disappearance. The surveillance quickly revealed that certain residents had been in communication with each other more frequently than usual since Eleanor's disappearance. James Fletcher, in particular, had made numerous phone calls to family members outside Millhaven, conversations that often included discussions about the lighthouse situation and concerns about family reputation. More intriguingly, the surveillance detected several instances of unusual nighttime activity around Millhaven. On multiple occasions, residents had been observed driving to remote locations along the coast, sometimes meeting with other individuals for brief conversations before returning home. These activities suggested possible attempts to dispose of evidence or coordinate responses to the ongoing investigation. The most significant development came when surveillance teams observed someone attempting to access the lighthouse property. During the early morning hours of September 18th, the individual, who approached by boat under cover of darkness, appeared to be searching the rocky shoreline around Beacon Point with a metal detector. When Coast Guard patrol boats responded to the area, the person fled in a small motorboat before identification was possible. Advanced forensic examination of the lighthouse and keeper's house revealed several pieces of evidence that had been missed during the initial investigation. Specialists using luminol detected traces of blood in the keeper's house that were not immediately visible to conventional examination. The blood was found in small quantities in several locations, suggesting either a struggle or attempts to clean up after an incident. DNA analysis of the blood samples, while limited by 1987 technology, confirmed that the blood was from at least 2 different individuals. One sample was consistent with Eleanor's DNA profile, established from personal items found in her bedroom. The second sample came from an unknown individual, potentially Eleanor's attacker or someone else, who had been present during whatever had occurred in the keeper's house. Fingerprint analysis revealed additional evidence of unauthorized entry into the keeper's house. Multiple sets of prints were found that did not match Eleanor, the previous lighthouse keepers, or any of the investigators who had examined the scene. Some of these prints were fresh, suggesting that someone had been in the house shortly before, or after Eleanor's disappearance. The lighthouse mechanism itself yielded crucial evidence about the sequence of events on the night of August 29th. Forensic examination of the electrical panel revealed that the switches had been operated by someone wearing gloves, as no fingerprints were found on the controls. However, microscopic analysis detected fibers from wool gloves that were consistent with winter clothing found in Eleanor's closet. This evidence suggested that Eleanor herself might have disabled the lighthouse, possibly under duress or as part of some planned action. The implications of this discovery significantly changed investigators' understanding of what had happened during Eleanor's final hours. Investigation of Eleanor's contacts outside Millhaven revealed a complex network of professional relationships that had been crucial to her research efforts. Eleanor had been working closely with maritime historians, federal law enforcement specialists, and legal experts who specialized in historical crime cases. Dr. Margaret Lawson, a maritime historian at Boston University, had been Eleanor's primary consultant on the historical aspects of the 1919 conspiracy. Dr. Lawson's files contained extensive correspondence with Eleanor, including detailed analysis of the conspiracy's operations and its impact on maritime safety during the World War era. According to Dr. Lawson, Eleanor had been planning to present her findings at a major maritime history conference scheduled for October 1987. This presentation would have brought national attention to the Millhaven case and would likely have resulted in federal prosecution of any living conspirators or their estates. Eleanor had been particularly excited about this opportunity to ensure that Catherine Blackwood's murder received proper historical recognition. More significantly, Dr. Lawson revealed that Eleanor had sent her a package of documents just days before her disappearance. This package, mailed on August 27th, contained copies of all Eleanor's research along with specific instructions about what should be done with the information if Eleanor was unable to present it herself. The package also contained a sealed envelope that Eleanor had asked Dr. Lawson to open only if something happened to Eleanor. Inside this envelope was a detailed account of the threats and harassment Eleanor had been experiencing, along with Eleanor's suspicions about which current Millhaven residents might be involved in attempts to suppress her research. Eleanor's sealed letter contained specific accusations that sent shockwaves through the investigation. She directly implicated James Fletcher, harbor master Paul Richards, and businessman Thomas Morrison in a conspiracy to prevent her research from becoming public. According to Eleanor's letter, these three men were aware of their family's involvement in the 1919 conspiracy and had been working together to intimidate Eleanor into abandoning her investigation. Eleanor's letter described several incidents of harassment that had not been previously known to investigators. She claimed that her research materials had been tampered with on multiple occasions, that she had been followed during her trips to the library and general store, and that she had received anonymous threats warning her to stop her historical research. Most disturbing, Eleanor's letter indicated that she believed these individuals knew the location of Catherine Blackwood's remains and had been taking steps to ensure that the burial site would never be discovered. She theorized that the recent renovation work around the lighthouse foundation had been motivated not by maintenance needs, but by a desire to further conceal the evidence of Catherine's murder. Eleanor concluded her letter with a chilling prediction. "If something happens to me, it will not be an accident. The same people who killed Catherine Blackwood in 1919 are still protecting their secrets, and they will do whatever is necessary to keep the truth buried." Armed with Eleanor's accusations and the growing body of physical evidence, the task force moved to interrogate the three men she had named. The interviews were conducted simultaneously to prevent the suspects from coordinating their responses, and each was questioned by experienced federal agents trained in detecting deception. James Fletcher's interview revealed a man who was clearly nervous about the direction of the investigation. While he denied any involvement in Eleanor's disappearance, Fletcher admitted that he had been concerned about the potential impact of her research on his family's reputation. He acknowledged making phone calls to relatives outside Millhaven to discuss the situation, but claimed these were innocent family conversations rather than conspiratorial planning. Fletcher's account of his activities on the night of August 29th was vague and inconsistent. He claimed to have spent the evening at home reading, but could provide no witnesses to corroborate this alibi. When confronted with evidence of unusual phone activity from his home that evening, Fletcher became evasive and requested an attorney. Harbor Master Paul Richards presented a more controlled demeanor during his interview, but his responses revealed detailed knowledge of Eleanor's research that he should not have possessed. Richards knew specific details about Eleanor's discoveries and her planned meetings with federal authorities, information that Eleanor had not shared publicly. When asked how he had obtained this knowledge, Richards claimed it was common knowledge in the town, but investigators found no evidence to support this assertion. Thomas Morrison's interview proved most revealing. Morrison admitted that he had been aware of his family's involvement in the 1919 conspiracy and had been concerned about the potential legal implications of Eleanor's research. He acknowledged that he, Fletcher, and Richards had discussed the situation on multiple occasions and had considered various ways to discourage Eleanor from pursuing her investigation. However, Morrison denied any involvement in Eleanor's disappearance and claimed that their discussions had focused only on legal methods of protecting their family's reputations. He admitted to visiting the lighthouse property on several occasions to observe Eleanor's research activities, but insisted that these visits had been motivated by curiosity rather than malicious intent. All three suspects agreed to submit to polygraph examinations, though their attorneys advised against it. The results of these tests provided mixed but suggestive evidence about their potential involvement in Eleanor's disappearance. James Fletcher's polygraph indicated deception when he was asked about his knowledge of Eleanor's fate and his activities on the night of August 29th. The test administrator noted that Fletcher showed classic signs of stress and deception when discussing his interactions with Eleanor and his awareness of threats against her. Paul Richards' polygraph results were inconclusive, suggesting that while he might not have been directly involved in Eleanor's disappearance, he possessed knowledge about the incident that he was not revealing. Richards showed particular stress when asked about conversations he had had with Fletcher and Morrison regarding Eleanor's research. Thomas Morrison's polygraph suggested that he was being truthful about his lack of direct involvement in Eleanor's disappearance, but indicated deception when he was asked about his knowledge of other people's plans regarding Eleanor. The test suggested that Morrison might have been aware of a conspiracy against Eleanor without being an active participant. While polygraph results are not admissible in court, they provided investigators with guidance about where to focus their continued efforts. The results suggested that Fletcher was likely the most directly involved in whatever had happened to Eleanor, while Richards and Morrison might have been aware of plans or actions without being primary participants. Based on the evidence emerging from the interrogations and forensic examinations, the task force expanded its search for Eleanor to include areas beyond the immediate vicinity of the lighthouse. If Eleanor had been abducted or harmed, her body might have been moved to a location far from Beacon Point to avoid discovery. The search operation, coordinated by Coast Guard specialists with extensive experience in maritime search and rescue, employed sophisticated sonar equipment to examine underwater areas along the entire Millhaven coast. Additionally, ground-penetrating radar was used to survey potential burial sites throughout the region. focusing on areas that would have been accessible to the suspects on the night of Eleanor's disappearance. Volunteers from throughout Maine joined the search effort, motivated by widespread media coverage of Eleanor's disappearance and the historical crimes she had been investigating. The case had captured public attention not only because of its mysterious circumstances, but also because it represented a rare opportunity to solve crimes that had remained hidden for nearly 70 years. The intensive search revealed several items of potential evidence. A piece of cloth matching Eleanor's jacket was found caught on rocks approximately 2 miles south of the lighthouse, in an area accessible by boat but difficult to reach from land. While the cloth could not be definitively linked to Eleanor's disappearance, its location suggested that she might have been transported along the coast rather than having simply vanished from the lighthouse property. Asterisk as the investigation continued. Through October 1987, pressure mounted within Millhaven's community. The ongoing federal presence had disrupted normal life in the town, with investigators conducting interviews, searches, and surveillance operations that affected virtually every resident. Local businesses were struggling as the constant media attention and law enforcement activity discouraged tourists and disrupted fishing operations. Some residents began to express resentment about the attention being focused on events from 70 years in the past. A group of townspeople, led by several descendants of families implicated in Eleanor's research, petitioned federal authorities to conclude the investigation and allow Millhaven to return to normal. They argued that pursuing decades-old crimes was disrupting a peaceful community and unfairly targeting families for the actions of their ancestors. However, other residents strongly supported the continued investigation. They argued that Eleanor's disappearance demanded justice and that the historical crimes she had uncovered deserved to be fully investigated regardless of their age. This faction, led by librarian Patricia Donnelly and several local fishermen, organized support activities for the investigation and lobbied state and federal authorities to maintain their commitment to solving the case. The division within the community created additional challenges for investigators, who found some residents reluctant to provide information, while others were eager to share gossip and speculation. Agent Molina noted that the polarized atmosphere made it difficult to distinguish between reliable witness testimony and statements influenced by community politics. Asterisk. On October 15, 1987, exactly 68 years after Catherine Blackwood's disappearance, the investigation achieved a significant breakthrough. A local fisherman, Captain Frank Delacroix, came forward with information that he had been reluctant to share earlier, due to its implications for people he had known for decades. Delacroix revealed that on the night of Eleanor's disappearance, he had observed unusual boat activity in the waters around Beacon Point. While returning from a late fishing trip, he had seen 2 boats operating without navigation lights in the area near the lighthouse. This was highly unusual and potentially dangerous behavior that had concerned him at the time. More significantly, Delacroix had recognized one of the boats as belonging to Harbor Master Paul Richards. The second boat was unfamiliar to him, but it appeared to be a small motorboat of the type commonly used by local residents for recreational fishing. The boats had been operating in coordination, with one staying near the lighthouse while the other moved back and forth along the coast. Delacroix's reluctance to report this information earlier had stemmed from his friendship with Richards and his unwillingness to implicate a respected community member without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. However, as the investigation continued and more evidence of a conspiracy emerged, Delacroix had decided that his civic duty outweighed his personal loyalties. Asterisk investigation of Paul Richards' boat revealed several pieces of evidence that supported Delacroix's testimony. Forensic examination detected traces of blood on the boat's deck, blood that DNA analysis suggested might have come from Eleanor. Additionally, fibers matching Eleanor's clothing were found caught on various parts of the boat's equipment. The boat's fuel consumption records indicated that it had been used extensively on the night of August 29th, far more than would have been necessary for Richard's claimed activities that evening. GPS equipment, while primitive by later standards, suggested that the boat had traveled to several locations along the coast during the overnight hours, including areas that were consistent with the search operations conducted by federal investigators. Most damning, hidden compartments in the boat contained materials that appeared to be connected to Eleanor's research. These included photocopies of some of the historical documents Eleanor had discovered, along with notes written in Richard's handwriting that outlined strategies for discrediting Eleanor's findings and preventing their publication. The discovery of these materials provided the first concrete evidence linking one of the suspects directly to Eleanor's disappearance. While the evidence was circumstantial, it strongly suggested that Richards had been involved in some form of conspiracy against Eleanor and that he had used his boat to transport either Eleanor herself or evidence related to her disappearance. Asterisk faced with mounting evidence of his involvement, Paul Richards requested a meeting with federal investigators on October 20th, 1987. Richards appeared to be preparing to provide information about Eleanor's disappearance, but his attorney advised against making any statements without immunity guarantees that prosecutors were unwilling to provide. During preliminary discussions with investigators, Richards indicated that Eleanor's disappearance had not been planned as a permanent solution to the problems created by her research. According to Richards, the initial intention had been to intimidate Eleanor into abandoning her investigation and leaving Millhaven voluntarily. Richards suggested that events on the night of August 29th had escalated beyond the conspirators' original plans, resulting in Eleanor's death rather than her intimidation. However, he refused to provide specific details about what had occurred without legal protections that would shield him from prosecution for Eleanor's murder. The attempted confession created a dilemma for investigators and prosecutors. While Richard's information might provide crucial details about Eleanor's fate and the location of her remains, accepting his conditions would effectively allow him to escape serious consequences for his actions. Federal prosecutors ultimately decided that justice for Eleanor required pursuing full charges against all conspirators, rather than accepting limited information in exchange for reduced penalties. Asterisk, by November 1987, the investigation had reached a frustrating impasse. While investigators had developed compelling evidence of a conspiracy involving Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison, they lacked definitive proof of what had happened to Eleanor or where her remains might be located. The suspects had retained experienced criminal defense attorneys and were no longer cooperating with the investigation. The physical evidence, while suggestive, was not sufficient to support murder charges against any of the suspects. The blood traces, fiber evidence, and witness testimony established that something significant had occurred on the night of Eleanor's disappearance, but they did not definitively prove that Eleanor had been killed or identify who might have been responsible for her death. Federal prosecutors faced the difficult decision of whether to proceed with charges based on the available evidence or to continue the investigation in hopes of developing stronger proof. The case had consumed significant resources for over 2 months, and pressure was mounting from various sources to either file charges or close the investigation. Adding to the complexity was the realization that even if the current suspects were prosecuted successfully, Eleanor's fate might never be definitively established. The vast coastline around Millhaven provided countless locations where remains might have been concealed, and the passage of time had likely eliminated much of the physical evidence that might have provided clear answers about what had happened to Eleanor. Asterisk, the first major theory developed by investigators centered on the possibility that Eleanor's disappearance had resulted from an intimidation attempt that had gone tragically wrong. According to this theory, Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison had conspired to frighten Eleanor into abandoning her research, but their plan had escalated into violence when Eleanor refused to be deterred. This theory was supported by the evidence of increasing harassment that Eleanor had experienced during her final weeks in Millhaven. The anonymous phone calls, the intrusions into her home, and the surveillance of her activities all suggested a systematic campaign designed to pressure Eleanor into leaving town. The theory proposed that the conspirators had initially hoped to drive Eleanor away without resorting to violence, preserving their family's reputations while avoiding the risks associated with more serious crimes. The intimidation theory suggested that on the night of August 29th, the conspirators had arranged to meet with Eleanor at the lighthouse to deliver an ultimatum: abandon her research and leave Millhaven, or face serious consequences. According to this scenario, Eleanor had agreed to disable the lighthouse beacon as a signal that she was prepared to comply with their demands. But the meeting had deteriorated when Eleanor refused to surrender her research materials or abandon her plans to present her findings to federal authorities. Under this theory, Eleanor's death had been unplanned and possibly accidental, occurring during a struggle when the intimidation attempt failed to achieve its intended result. The conspirators had then been forced to dispose of Eleanor's body and eliminate evidence of their involvement, leading to the careful planning and coordination that had been observed in their subsequent behavior. Intimidation theory explained many aspects of the case, including the deliberate shutdown of the lighthouse, the evidence of boat activity on the night of Eleanor's disappearance, and the suspect's detailed knowledge of Eleanor's research and plans. However, it also raised questions about why experienced community leaders would have resorted to such extreme measures rather than pursuing legal or political methods of addressing their concerns about Eleanor's research. Asterisk, a more sinister theory proposed that Eleanor's disappearance had been the result of a carefully planned murder designed to permanently silence her investigation. This theory suggested that the conspirators had determined that Eleanor's research posed an existential threat to their families' reputations and had decided that only her death would provide adequate protection against the exposure of historical crimes. The premeditated murder theory was supported by evidence that the conspirators had been monitoring Eleanor's activities for months before her disappearance. The sophistication of their surveillance, their detailed knowledge of her research and contacts, and their coordination in responding to the investigation all suggested a level of planning that went beyond spontaneous intimidation attempts. This theory, the meeting at the lighthouse, had been arranged specifically to kill Eleanor and eliminate her research. The shutdown of the lighthouse beacon had been part of the plan, creating a plausible cover story that Eleanor had been conducting routine maintenance when she suffered an accident or was attacked by unknown assailants. The careful coordination of boat movements and the elimination of physical evidence all supported the idea of premeditated murder rather than spontaneous violence. The premeditated murder theory also explained the thoroughness with which Eleanor's research materials had been removed from the keeper's house. If the conspirators had been planning Eleanor's death, they would have prepared to eliminate all traces of her discoveries, ensuring that even her death would not result in the exposure of the historical crime she had investigated. However, this theory faced challenges in explaining some aspects of the evidence. The blood traces found in the keeper's house suggested that some form of struggle or violence had occurred there, which would have been unnecessary if Eleanor had been lured to a remote location for a planned execution. Additionally, the theory required attributing a level of criminal sophistication to the suspects that seemed inconsistent with their otherwise conventional lives as small-town community leaders. Asterisk A. Third theory proposed that Eleanor's disappearance had resulted from an accident that had occurred during a confrontation with the conspirators, but that the accident had been covered up to prevent exposure of the intimidation campaign that had preceded it. This theory suggested that Eleanor's death had been genuinely unintended, but that the conspirators' fear of prosecution had led them to dispose of her body and, quote, to eliminate evidence of their involvement. The accidental death theory was supported by evidence that suggested the conspirators had been unprepared for some aspects of the events. On August 29th, the blood evidence in the keeper's house, the hasty removal of Eleanor's research materials, and the imperfect elimination of physical evidence all suggested a response to unexpected events rather than the execution of a carefully planned murder. Under this theory, Eleanor had arranged to meet with the conspirators to confront them about their harassment campaign and to warn them that she intended to proceed with her research regardless of their threats. The meeting had become heated when Eleanor refused to be intimidated, and during the confrontation, Eleanor had suffered injuries that had resulted in her death. The theory proposed that Eleanor's death had been the result of a fall, a heart attack, brought on by stress or injuries sustained during a struggle, but that the conspirators had panicked when they realized she was dead. Rather than reporting the incident and facing prosecution for their intimidation campaign, they had decided to conceal Eleanor's death and dispose of her body. The accidental death theory explained the evidence of hasty planning and imperfect execution that characterized the cover-up efforts. It also provided a psychological explanation for the conspirators' behavior that was more consistent with their backgrounds as respected community members rather than hardened criminals. Asterisk, perhaps the most controversial theory proposed that Eleanor had not been killed at all, but had staged her own disappearance to escape threats to her safety, while ensuring that her research would eventually be revealed. This theory suggested that Eleanor had become aware of the conspiracy against her and had decided that disappearing voluntarily was her best option for both preserving her life and guaranteeing that the historical crime she had uncovered would eventually receive proper attention. The voluntary disappearance theory was supported by evidence of Eleanor's extensive preparations for potential danger. Her multiple copies of research materials, her contacts with federal authorities, and her detailed instructions about what should be done if something happened to her all suggested someone who was planning for various contingencies. Under this theory, Eleanor had arranged with accomplices outside Millhaven to help her disappear, possibly with assistance from federal agents who were already investigating the historical conspiracy. The shutdown of the lighthouse beacon had been Eleanor's signal that she was implementing her disappearance plan, and the blood evidence in the keeper's house had been staged to suggest violence rather than voluntary departure. The theory proposed that Eleanor was living under a new identity somewhere outside Maine, waiting for the investigation to develop sufficient evidence to prosecute the conspirators without requiring her testimony. Once the historical crimes had been fully exposed and justice had been served, Eleanor would reveal herself and explain her disappearance. While this theory addressed some puzzling aspects of the case, it faced significant challenges. The blood evidence appeared to be genuine rather than staged, and Eleanor's personal effects and financial accounts showed no signs of preparation for a planned disappearance. Additionally, the theory required believing that Eleanor would have abandoned her life's work and personal relationships without compelling evidence that less extreme alternatives were unavailable. Asterisk. Final major theory proposed that Eleanor's disappearance had been orchestrated by individuals outside the immediate circle of suspects, possibly by organized crime figures who had been involved in the original 1919 conspiracy or their descendants. This theory suggested that the smuggling operation that had led to Catherine Blackwood's murder had been part of a larger criminal network that had continued to operate in various forms throughout the 20th century. The outside actor theory was supported by evidence that the original conspiracy had involved maritime smuggling, an activity that was often controlled by organized crime families during the Prohibition era and beyond. The sophistication of the operation, its duration over several years, and its ability to corrupt local officials all suggested connections to professional criminal organizations rather than purely local corruption. Under this theory, Eleanor's research had threatened to expose not only the historical crimes in Millhaven, but also the ongoing activities of criminal organizations that had evolved from the original conspiracy. Her disappearance had been ordered by higher-level criminal figures who viewed her investigation as a threat to their current operations or to family members who might face prosecution for historical crimes. The theory explained some puzzling aspects of the case, including the apparent surveillance of Eleanor by individuals who had not been identified, the sophistication of the evidence elimination efforts, and the reluctance of local suspects to provide information even when facing serious charges themselves. However, the outside actor theory was difficult to investigate given the limited resources available to federal authorities and the passage of time since the original conspiracy. While the theory remained plausible, investigators found little concrete evidence to support it beyond the circumstantial connections between historical smuggling activities and Eleanor's research. FBI behavioral specialists developed psychological profiles of both Eleanor and the primary suspects to better understand the motivations and decision-making processes that might have contributed to the events of August 29, 1987. These profiles provided additional insight into the various theories about what had happened to Eleanor. Eleanor's psychological profile described her as a highly intelligent and methodical individual who was driven by a strong sense of justice and historical accuracy. Her background in the Coast Guard and the National Park Service had taught her to value institutional authority and proper procedures, but her research had revealed crimes that local institutions had failed to address adequately. The profile suggested that Eleanor had been caught between her respect for authority and her determination to ensure that historical crimes received proper recognition. This internal conflict might have led her to take increasingly risky actions as she became more frustrated with the slow pace of official investigations. Profiles of Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison described them as conventional individuals who had been motivated primarily by concerns about family reputation rather than by criminal intent. The profile suggested that these men had been unprepared for the escalating seriousness of their situation and had made increasingly poor decisions as they became more desperate to protect their families from scandal. The psychological analysis supported theories that involved unplanned escalation rather than premeditated murder. The profile suggested that the suspects were more likely to have responded impulsively to perceived threats than to have engaged in careful criminal planning. Asterisk investigators also considered the possibility that Eleanor's disappearance had been influenced by what psychologists term historical trauma, the way that past events continue to affect communities and families across generations. In Millhaven, the unresolved crimes of 1919 had created a legacy of secrets and guilt that had shaped community dynamics for nearly 70 years. The historical trauma theory suggested that the conspiracy against Eleanor had been motivated not just by rational concerns about reputation and legal liability, but by deeper psychological needs to maintain the collective denial that had allowed the community to function, despite harboring dark secrets. Eleanor's research had threatened to shatter this psychological equilibrium, creating intense anxiety that had led to increasingly extreme responses. Under this interpretation, Eleanor's disappearance represented the community's unconscious attempt to eliminate the source of psychological disruption rather than face the difficult process of acknowledging and addressing historical crimes. The theory provided a framework for understanding why otherwise rational individuals might have resorted to desperate measures rather than seeking legal or political solutions to their concerns about Eleanor's research. The historical trauma theory also explained the polarized response within Millhaven's community to the investigation. Residents who supported the investigation were psychologically prepared to confront difficult historical truths, while those who opposed it were protecting themselves against psychological disruption that might result from acknowledging their community's dark past. Asterisk, despite extensive investigation and analysis, several crucial questions about Eleanor's disappearance remained unanswered. The location of Eleanor's remains, if she was indeed dead, continued to elude investigators despite comprehensive searches of the areas around Millhaven. The specific sequence of events on August 29, 1987, remained unclear, with various theories, providing plausible but incomplete explanations for the available evidence. Perhaps most frustratingly, the exact nature of Eleanor's final discoveries remained uncertain. While investigators had found extensive research materials in Eleanor's files, the original documents that Catherine Blackwood had hidden in 1919 had disappeared along with Eleanor. Without these primary sources, the full scope of the historical conspiracy and its implications for current prosecutions remained difficult to establish definitively. The investigation had revealed corruption and cover-ups that spanned nearly 70 years, but the complex web of family relationships, community loyalties, and historical secrets continued to resist complete understanding. Eleanor's disappearance had become part of Millhaven's ongoing story of unresolved mysteries rather than providing the closure that her research had seemed to promise. Asterisk. As 1987 drew to a close, the investigation into Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance entered a phase that investigators privately acknowledged might become permanent. The early enthusiasm and intensive activity of the federal task force had given way to the methodical, less dramatic work of following leads that grew colder with each passing week. The lighthouse stood operational once again, its beam cutting through the winter darkness as it had for nearly a century, but the keeper's house remained empty. The Coast Guard had assigned temporary personnel to maintain the light, but no one seemed eager to live in the isolated building where Eleanor had spent her final night. Local residents reported that the lighthouse beam seemed somehow different, less steady or reliable than it had been under Eleanor's care. Though technical inspections revealed no mechanical problems, Agent Molina maintained a reduced presence in Millhaven, working from the field office in Portland while coordinating with local authorities, who continued to follow up on tips and conduct periodic searches. The intensive surveillance of the primary suspects had been scaled back, though their movements and communications continued to be monitored through less intrusive methods. The three men who had been at the center of the investigation, Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison, had settled into an uneasy routine of cooperation with ongoing inquiries while maintaining their innocence. Fletcher had taken a leave of absence from the town council, citing health concerns. Richards continued his duties as harbor master, though under closer supervision from Coast Guard personnel. Morrison had relocated temporarily to stay with relatives in another state, ostensibly to avoid the continuing media attention. Millhaven itself began the slow process of adapting to its transformed identity. The quiet fishing village that had prided itself on its peaceful anonymity had become known throughout New England as the site of mysterious disappearances spanning nearly 70 years. Tourism increased, but it was a different kind of visitor who now came to Millhaven, people drawn by true crime podcasts and sensational newspaper articles rather than those seeking authentic maritime charm. The Anchor Inn found itself hosting amateur investigators who spent their evenings poring over maps of the coastline and theorizing about what might have happened to Eleanor Blackwood. Thompson's General Store sold souvenirs that it never had before, postcards featuring the lighthouse, books about unsolved mysteries, and maps highlighting the locations where significant events had occurred. Some longtime residents resented this transformation of their community into what one fisherman called a tourist attraction for ghoulish curiosity seekers. Others embraced the attention and the economic opportunities it provided, reasoning that Eleanor's disappearance had already changed Millhaven forever, and that they might as well benefit from the change. The library, where Eleanor had spent so many hours researching the historical conspiracy, became an unofficial memorial to her investigation. Patricia Donnelly created a display case containing reproductions of some of Eleanor's research materials, along with historical information about the lighthouse and the original Blackwood family. The display attracted visitors from throughout New England who were fascinated by the connection between past and present mysteries. Asterisk. Federal prosecutors faced difficult decisions about how to proceed with the limited evidence they had developed against Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison. While the circumstantial case for their involvement in Eleanor's disappearance was compelling, it remained insufficient to support murder charges that could result in conviction at trial. In January 1988, a federal grand jury was convened to review the evidence and consider possible indictments. The grand jury proceedings, conducted in secret, allowed prosecutors to present their case without the constraints that would apply at a public trial. Witnesses including Captain Delacroix, Dr. Lawson, and various federal investigators provided testimony about Eleanor's research, her disappearance, and the evidence linking the suspects to both events. After 6 weeks of deliberation, the grand jury returned mixed results. James Fletcher was indicted on charges of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation and intimidation of a federal witness, charges that carried significant prison sentences but fell short of murder. Paul Richards was indicted on similar charges, plus additional counts related to the misuse of his official position as harbor master. Thomas Morrison was not indicted, with grand jurors apparently persuaded by his testimony that while he had been aware of discussions about Eleanor's research, he had not participated in any criminal conspiracy against her. However, Morrison remained a subject of the ongoing investigation, and prosecutors reserved the right to seek additional charges if new evidence emerged. The indictments provided some measure of justice for Eleanor's disappearance, but they also highlighted the limitations of the case that had been developed against the suspects. Without Eleanor's body or definitive evidence about what had happened to her, prosecutors were unable to pursue the most serious charges that her disappearance seemed to warrant. Asterisk. The trial of James Fletcher and Paul Richards began in September 1988, almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor's disappearance. The federal courthouse in Portland was packed with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and Millhaven residents who had followed the case from its beginning. Prosecutor David Chun, no relation to Margaret and Thomas Chun from Millhaven, presented a methodical case that traced Eleanor's research from her arrival in Millhaven through her discovery of Catherine Blackwood's documents. The prosecution argued that Fletcher and Richards had conspired to intimidate Eleanor into abandoning her investigation, and that their campaign of harassment had escalated into violence when Eleanor refused to be deterred. The evidence presented included Eleanor's journal entries documenting the threats and harassment she had experienced, forensic evidence from Richards' boat, and testimony from witnesses who had observed unusual activities around the time of Eleanor's disappearance. Dr. Lawson's testimony about Eleanor's research and her planned presentations to federal authorities established the motive for the defendants' alleged actions. Defense attorneys countered that the evidence was purely circumstantial and that Eleanor's disappearance could have been the result of numerous factors unrelated to their clients. They suggested that Eleanor might have suffered an accident during her evening walks, might have been the victim of a random crime committed by transient individuals, or might even have staged her own disappearance for reasons known only to herself. Defense also challenged the reliability of some prosecution witnesses, suggesting that the highly publicized nature of the case had influenced their recollections and created pressure to provide testimony that supported the prosecution's theory. They pointed out that despite extensive searches and investigation, no definitive proof of Eleanor's death had been discovered. Asterisk. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned verdicts that reflected the ambiguous nature of the evidence. James Fletcher was convicted on charges of conspiracy and witness intimidation, but acquitted on the more serious charges that carried longer sentences. Paul Richards was convicted of misusing his official position, but acquitted of conspiracy. Charges. The verdict satisfied neither the prosecution, which had hoped for convictions on more serious charges, nor the defense, which had argued for complete acquittal. Fletcher was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, while Richards received 18 months in prison and permanent removal from his position as harbor master. The sentences were seen by many observers as inadequate given the apparent scope of the conspiracy against Eleanor and the likelihood that she had been killed. However, federal prosecutors acknowledged that the verdicts represented the best outcome possible given the limitations of the evidence and the high burden of proof required in criminal cases. In statements following the trial, both defendants maintained their innocence of any involvement in Eleanor's disappearance while accepting responsibility for their attempts to discourage her research. Fletcher's attorney characterized his client's actions as misguided attempts to protect his family's reputation, while Richard's attorney described his behavior as poor judgment rather than criminal conspiracy. Asterisk. Even as the legal proceedings concluded, efforts to locate Eleanor's remains continued sporadically. Amateur searchers, organized through internet forums and true crime communities, conducted regular expeditions along the Maine coast, looking for clues that professional investigators might have missed. These volunteer efforts were sometimes welcomed by law enforcement, but they also created challenges as inexperienced searchers occasionally compromised potential evidence or put themselves in danger while exploring treacherous coastal terrain. The Maine State Police established protocols for coordinating with volunteer searchers while maintaining professional control over the investigation. Several promising leads emerged from these citizen investigations, but none resulted in the discovery of Eleanor's remains or conclusive evidence about her fate. Items of clothing found along the coast generated excitement and media attention, but forensic analysis consistently revealed that they were unrelated to Eleanor's disappearance. The most significant development came in 1991 when scuba divers exploring underwater caves near Beacon Point discovered what appeared to be personal belongings that might have been Eleanor's. However, detailed examination revealed that the items had been underwater for much longer than 4 years and were likely related to much older maritime accidents. Asterisk. By the mid-1990s, Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance had officially become a cold case, though it remained open in the files of multiple law enforcement agencies. Agent Molina retired from the FBI in 1995, but she continued to work part-time as a consultant on the case, reviewing new leads and maintaining contact with Eleanor's former colleagues who continued to hope for resolution. Advances in forensic technology periodically renewed interest in the case. DNA analysis techniques that had been unavailable in 1987 were applied to evidence from the lighthouse and keeper's house, but they provided no new insights into Eleanor's fate. Ground-penetrating radar technology continued to improve, leading to occasional new searches of areas around Millhaven. But these efforts also failed to locate Eleanor's remains. The case file grew to encompass thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, forensic analyses, and investigative theories, but the central questions remained unanswered. Where was Eleanor Blackwood? What exactly had happened on the night of August 29, 1987? Who, if anyone, was responsible for her disappearance? Asterisk. Despite the lack of resolution in her disappearance, Eleanor's research had achieved much of what she had hoped to accomplish. The discovery of Catherine Blackwood's remains and the documentation of the 1919 conspiracy had provided historical recognition for crimes that had been hidden for nearly 70 years. Catherine Blackwood was finally laid to rest in Millhaven's historic cemetery, with a headstone that identified her as a victim of murder and recognized her courage in investigating corruption despite the personal risks involved. A small ceremony attended by Eleanor's former colleagues, federal investigators, and some Millhaven residents marked the belated funeral of someone who had been forgotten by history until Eleanor's research brought her story to light. The lighthouse itself became a memorial to both women who had disappeared while seeking justice for historical crimes. The National Park Service, recognizing the historical significance of the site, designated it as a historic landmark with interpretive displays. that told the stories of Catherine and Eleanor Blackwood. Visitors could learn about the lighthouse's operational history, the crimes that had threatened its mission, and the two women whose investigations had ultimately exposed those crimes. Eleanor's research was published posthumously in maritime history journals and formed the basis for several books about corruption in early 20th century coastal communities. Her methodology and discoveries became case studies in academic programs, inspiring other researchers to investigate similar historical crimes that might have been overlooked or covered up. Throughout the 1990s and beyond, Eleanor's sister Margaret conducted her own investigation into what had happened in Millhaven. Margaret Blackwood, she had resumed using Eleanor's surname after learning about their possible family connection to Catherine, visited Maine regularly, following up on leads and maintaining pressure on law enforcement agencies to continue their efforts. Margaret's investigation revealed that Eleanor had been more secretive about her personal life than even close friends had realized. Eleanor had apparently conducted extensive genealogical research that she had not shared with anyone. Research that suggested a definitive family connection between herself and Catherine Blackwood of 1919. According to Margaret's findings, Eleanor had been Catherine Blackwood's great-niece, the granddaughter of Catherine's brother, who had left Millhaven shortly after his sister's disappearance. Eleanor had apparently discovered this family connection during her initial research and had been motivated, not just by historical interest, but by a desire to learn the truth about her great-aunt's fate. This revelation added new dimensions to understanding Eleanor's commitment to her research and her willingness to take risks that others might have avoided. Eleanor had not been investigating abstract historical crimes, but seeking justice for a family member whose disappearance had affected her own family's history. Margaret's efforts also revealed that Eleanor had been more aware of potential danger than she had let on. Hidden among Eleanor's personal papers, Margaret found evidence that Eleanor had been making regular payments to a private security firm, apparently for protection services that she had never mentioned to anyone in ILLHAVEN. In 2007, 20 years after Eleanor's disappearance, the case received renewed attention when the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit was reorganized with additional resources and new personnel. Detective Lisa Walsh, a specialist in historical crimes, was assigned to review the Eleanor Blackwood case using modern investigative techniques and technologies that had not been available to the original investigators. Detective Walsh's review identified several areas where new approaches might yield additional evidence. Cellular phone records, which had been primitive in 1987, could now be analyzed more comprehensively to track the movements and communications of the suspects during the critical time period. Satellite imagery, while not retroactive, could help identify changes in the landscape around Millhaven that might indicate burial sites or evidence disposal locations. Most significantly, social media and internet genealogy databases had created new opportunities to trace family connections and identify individuals who might have information about Eleanor's disappearance. Detective Walsh was able to contact descendants of many families who had lived in Millhaven during both 1919 and 1987, discovering previously unknown witnesses and sources of information. These efforts led to several new leads, including the identification of individuals who had observed suspicious activities during the time of Eleanor's disappearance, but had never been interviewed by the original investigators. However, the passage of time had also eliminated many potential sources of evidence, as witnesses had died and physical evidence had degraded beyond usefulness. As the case entered its fourth decade, Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance had become woven into the fabric of Millhaven's identity. The lighthouse continued to operate, now fully automated but maintained as a historic site, with Eleanor's story part of the official interpretation of the location's significance. New residents who moved to Millhaven quickly learned about the town's mysterious history, and longtime residents had grown accustomed to occasional visits from journalists. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators seeking to solve the case that had eluded professional law enforcement for so many years. The case had inspired numerous theories, from the plausible to the fantastic. Some investigators continued to believe that Eleanor's disappearance was the result of the conspiracy involving Fletcher, Richards, and Morrison, despite the limited convictions that had resulted from their prosecution. Others theorized that Eleanor had been the victim of different perpetrators entirely, possibly individuals with connections to the historical crime she had been investigating. More exotic theories proposed that Eleanor had successfully staged her disappearance and was living under an assumed identity somewhere beyond the reach of those who had threatened her. Supporters of this theory pointed to Eleanor's careful preparations and her apparent awareness of danger as evidence that she had planned for the possibility of needing to disappear. Still others suggested that Eleanor's disappearance was connected to larger criminal conspiracies that extended far beyond Millhaven, possibly involving organized crime figures who had been threatened by her research into historical smuggling operations. These theories gained occasional support when other investigators uncovered evidence of criminal activities along the Maine coast during the early 20th century, but definitive connections to Eleanor's case remained elusive. Asterisk today, more than 35 years after Eleanor Blackwood's disappearance, the case remains officially open and continues to attract attention from law enforcement agencies, academic researchers, and amateur investigators. The FBI maintains a file on the case, and the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit reviews it periodically for new leads or opportunities to apply advancing forensic technologies. The lighthouse at Beacon Point stands as a monument to the enduring mysteries that surround Eleanor's disappearance and Catherine Blackwood's murder. Visitors can still see the keeper's house where Eleanor lived during her final months, the rocky shoreline where she conducted her evening searches, and the tide pools where she discovered the evidence that may have cost her life. Local guides tell Eleanor's story to tourists, describing her as a dedicated researcher whose commitment to historical truth led her into danger she could not have anticipated. The story has become part of Millhaven's identity, a reminder that even in peaceful coastal communities, secrets can lie buried for generations until someone with courage and determination brings them to light. Eleanor's research materials, preserved in academic archives and law enforcement files, continue to provide insights into the corruption and violence that characterized some aspects of early 20th century coastal life. Her methodology and discoveries have influenced other historical investigations, and her story has become a cautionary tale about the risks faced by researchers who investigate powerful interests. But the central questions about Eleanor's fate remain unanswered. Somewhere along the rocky Maine coast, perhaps in a location that has been searched repeatedly, or perhaps in a place that has never occurred to investigators, the truth about what happened to Eleanor Blackwood waits to be discovered. Asterisk as you drift towards sleep tonight, listening to the gentle sound of rain against your window. Imagine the lighthouse beam at Beacon Point sweeping steadily across the dark waters of the Atlantic. The light continues its century-old mission of guiding mariners safely through treacherous waters, just as Eleanor Blackwood would have wanted. The beam illuminates the rocky shore where Eleanor walked on her final evening, searching for clues about crimes that had been hidden for 70 years. It touches the tide pools where she made discoveries that changed our understanding of Millhaven's history. It reaches out across the water toward horizons that may hold the answers to questions that continue to echo through the fog-shrouded streets of this small coastal town. Eleanor's story reminds us that truth has a way of persisting even when powerful forces work to suppress it. Catherine Blackwood's murder was hidden for nearly 70 years before Eleanor's investigation brought it to light. Eleanor's own disappearance has remained a mystery for more than 3 decades, but somewhere in the depths of time and memory, the truth waits to be discovered. The lighthouse beam that Eleanor tended so carefully continues to cut through the darkness, A symbol of persistence in the face of uncertainty, of guidance offered even when the destination remains unclear. Like the question surrounding Eleanor's disappearance, the light travels into the darkness without knowing what it might illuminate, but committed to its mission of providing direction for those who need it. Tonight, as sleep carries you toward your own dreams and mysteries, let the rhythm of the lighthouse beam remind you that some stories continue long after their narrators have fallen silent, and that truth, like light itself, has the power to pierce even the deepest darkness. Rain continues to fall softly, just as it did on that autumn night in 1987 when Eleanor Blackwood took her final walk along the rocky shores of Beacon Point. In the sound of those gentle droplets against glass, in the whisper of wind through coastal pines, in the eternal rhythm of waves against stone, her story continues, waiting for the moment when darkness finally yields to light and mysteries transform into truth. Sleep well, and dream of lighthouses standing faithful watch over restless seas, their beams carrying forward the stories of those who have vanished into history, but whose searches for justice illuminate the way for all who follow in their footsteps. Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm your host, and tonight we journey to the misty countryside of northern England, to a place where time seems to move differently, where ancient stone walls hold secrets, and where one autumn evening, in 1987, something extraordinary happened that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. This is the story of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected botanist who disappeared without a trace from her locked study in Willowbrook Manor, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a mystery that continues to intrigue those who hear it. As the gentle rain falls outside your window tonight, let yourself be drawn into this tale of academic intrigue, family secrets, and the kind of mystery that feels as timeless as the old stones of the manor itself. Willowbrook Manor sits nestled in a valley in the Yorkshire Dales, surrounded by rolling hills that change color with the seasons like an artist's palette. Built in 1743 by the wealthy Thornfield family, the manor has weathered centuries of English history, its gray limestone walls bearing witness to births, deaths, celebrations, and sorrows. By 1987, it had become something quite different from the grand family estate it once was. It had been transformed into a unique residential research facility, a place where academics could live and work in peaceful isolation, pursuing their scholarly interests away from the distractions of university life. The transformation had been the vision of Dr. Edmund Thornfield, the last heir to the family fortune and a respected historian himself. Rather than sell the aging manor or convert it into a hotel, as so many similar properties had become, he chose to preserve its original character while adapting it for modern scholarly pursuits. The result was a remarkable institution that attracted researchers, writers, and academics from around the world, a place where intellectual curiosity could flourish in an atmosphere of quiet contemplation. Our story centers on Dr. Margaret Thornfield, no relation to the manor's founding family. Despite sharing the name, a botanist in her early 60s who had made Willowbrook her home for the past 3 years, Dr. Thornfield was known for her groundbreaking research into the medicinal properties of native English plants, work that had earned her recognition from botanical societies across Europe. She was a woman of routine and precision, qualities that made her subsequent disappearance all the more baffling to those who knew her well. The events we'll explore unfolded during the first week of October 1987, when the Yorkshire countryside was painted in brilliant oranges and deep reds, and the first hint of winter's approach could be felt in the evening air. It was a time when the manor's gardens, Dr. Thornfield's particular domain, displayed their final burst of color before settling into winter's rest. As we begin our journey into this mystery, imagine yourself walking up the curved gravel drive toward Willowbrook Manor on that crisp October evening. The manor's windows glow warmly against the gathering dusk. Smoke rises from several chimneys, and the last roses of the season nod in the gentle breeze. It's the kind of place where you might expect to find nothing more mysterious than a cat sleeping by the fire or the distant sound of someone practicing piano. But as we'll discover, even the most peaceful places can harbor the most perplexing mysteries. Asterisk, to understand what happened at Willowbrook Manor, we must first understand the woman at the center of our mystery. Dr. Margaret Thornfield was born. Margaret Hayes in 1925 in the small market town of Hexham, Northumberland. The daughter of a country doctor and a schoolteacher, she grew up surrounded by the natural beauty of the English countryside, developing an early fascination with the plants and wildflowers that grew along the stone walls and in the meadows. Surrounding her childhood home, her path to botany began, as many great passions do, with a single moment of wonder. At age 7, young Margaret discovered a patch of wild foxgloves growing in a secluded corner of her family's garden. Her father, Dr. William Hayes, noticed her interest and took the time to explain how these beautiful purple flowers contained digitalis, a substance that could either heal a weak heart or prove deadly in the wrong doses. This revelation, that something so lovely could hold such power, sparked a lifelong fascination with the hidden properties of plants. Margaret proved to be an exceptional student, excelling in her studies despite the limitations often placed on young women of her generation. She earned a scholarship to study botany at Cambridge University, where she distinguished herself not only through her academic achievements, but also through her patience and methodical approach to research. Her professors noted her particular gift for observation. She could spend hours studying a single plant specimen, noting details that others might overlook, building a comprehensive understanding of each subject that went far beyond surface appearances. After completing her doctorate in 1951 with a thesis on the medicinal applications of British native plants, Dr. Thornfield, she had married fellow botanist Dr. James Thornfield in 1950, began her career as a researcher with the Royal Botanic Gardens. Her work focused on documenting and preserving knowledge of traditional plant medicines, research that became increasingly important as modernization threatened many of the old ways of life in rural Britain. Asterisk. The 1950s and 1960s were productive years for Dr. Thornfield. She published numerous papers on ethnobotany, traveled throughout the British Isles documenting traditional plant uses, and built a reputation as one of the country's leading experts on medicinal flora. Her work took her to remote Scottish islands, Welsh mountain villages, and forgotten corners of Ireland, where she would sit with elderly herbalists and wise women, carefully recording their knowledge before it was lost forever. Tragedy touched her life in 1967 when her husband James died suddenly of a heart attack while conducting field research in the Hebrides. They had no children, and Dr. Thornfield found herself alone at age 42. Rather than retreat from her work, she threw herself into it with renewed dedication, as if preserving the ancient knowledge of plants had become not just her profession, but her calling. Asterisk. The next phase of her career saw her transition from active fieldwork to more contemplative research. She began writing what would become her masterwork, a comprehensive encyclopedia of British medicinal plants that would combine scientific analysis with traditional knowledge. This ambitious project required not just botanical expertise, but also skills in history, anthropology, and linguistics. Dr. Thornfield needed a place where she could work undisturbed, surrounded by the very plants she was studying. In 1984, she learned about Willowbrook Manor through a colleague at Cambridge, Dr. Edmund Thornfield again. No relation, despite the shared surname, had recently opened the manor as a residential research facility. The timing seemed perfect. Dr. Thornfield was approaching retirement age, but felt far from finished with her life's work. The manor offered not only the quiet environment she needed, but also access to extensive gardens where she could observe plants through all seasons, and a remarkable library that contained centuries of botanical and historical texts. Asterisk. The application process for residency at Willowbrook was selective. Dr. Edmund Thornfield personally reviewed each candidate, looking not just for academic credentials but for individuals who would contribute to the unique intellectual community he was trying to create. Dr. Margaret Thornfield's application stood out immediately. Her research aligned perfectly with the Manor's mission of preserving traditional knowledge, and her reputation in academic circles was impeccable. More importantly, her work ethic and temperament suggested she would thrive in the Manor's atmosphere of quiet scholarly pursuit. She arrived Willowbrook Manor in March 1984, during that magical time when winter finally loosens its grip and the first spring flowers begin to appear. She was assigned quarters on the second floor of the Manor's east wing, a spacious suite consisting of a bedroom, a small sitting room, and most importantly, a study with large windows overlooking the Manor's extensive gardens. The study quickly became the center of her world at Willowbrook, filled with botanical specimens, research notes, reference books, and the tools of her trade. Dr. Thornfield's routine at the Manor was as precise as her scientific method. She rose each morning at 6 o'clock, regardless of the season, and began her day with a walk through the gardens. These walks served multiple purposes. They provided exercise, allowed her to observe seasonal changes in the plant life, and offered a period of quiet reflection that helped her organize her thoughts for the day's work ahead. After her morning walk, she would breakfast in the Manor's dining room with the other residents, though she was known more as a listener than a contributor to the morning conversations. Her fellow residents, historians, archaeologists, writers, and other academics grew accustomed to her quiet presence and gentle smile. She had a way of remembering small details about others' work and would occasionally offer an insightful comment or helpful suggestion, but she never dominated discussions. Following breakfast, Dr. Thornfield would retreat to her study for the morning's work session. Her methodology was systematic and thorough. She would focus on a single plant species for days or sometimes weeks at a time, researching everything from its botanical classification and chemical composition to its traditional uses in folk medicine and its representation in historical texts and folklore. Her study became a fascinating intersection of science and history. Pressed flower specimens shared space with ancient herbals. Chemical analysis charts were filed alongside handwritten recipes copied from centuries-old manuscripts, and modern botanical texts stood beside collections of folklore and traditional stories. Visitors to her study often commented on the unique atmosphere she had created, scholarly, yet somehow mystical, grounded in rigorous science, yet open to the wisdom of ages past. Afternoons were typically devoted to correspondence and writing. Dr. Thornfield maintained an extensive network of contacts throughout the academic world and beyond. She exchanged letters with fellow botanists, historians, anthropologists, and even amateur plant enthusiasts who would write to share information about traditional uses of plants in their regions. Her correspondence files, meticulously organized, contained hundreds of letters from people across the British Isles and Europe, each contributing some piece to the vast puzzle she was assembling. Her writing process was as methodical as everything else she did. Each entry in her encyclopedia began with extensive research notes, followed by multiple drafts that she would revise and refine until every word was precise. She had a particular gift for making complex botanical information accessible to general readers while maintaining scientific accuracy. Her goal was to create a work that would serve both as a scholarly reference and as a practical guide for anyone interested in the traditional uses of plants. Evenings at Willowbrook Manor varied with the seasons and the social inclinations of the residents. During summer months, there might be outdoor gatherings in the gardens, informal lectures, or discussions that continued late into the night. Winter evenings were often spent in the Manor's library, where residents would read by the fire or engage in quiet conversations about their work. Dr. Thornfield participated in these gatherings when her mood permitted, but she was equally content to spend evenings alone in her study, working on her writing or simply sitting by her window, observing the garden by moonlight and thinking about the plants that slept beneath the soil, waiting for spring's return. Those who knew her well recognized that these quiet moments of observation and reflection were as important to her work as her daylight hours of active research. Asterisk by 1987, Dr. Thornfield had been at Willowbrook Manor for 3.5 years, and her encyclopedia project was nearing completion. She had documented over 200 British plant species, combining rigorous botanical science with historical research and traditional knowledge in a way that no previous work had achieved. The manuscript, which she estimated would run to nearly 800 pages when complete, represented not just her own expertise, but the collective wisdom of countless herbalists, healers, and plant enthusiasts who had shared their knowledge with her. Over the decades, her daily routine had become even more established with time. The other residents of the manor knew they could set their clocks by her morning walks, could expect to see the light in her study window until precisely 10 o'clock each evening, and could count on her presence at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Unless she was unwell, which was rare, as she enjoyed remarkably good health for a woman in her early 60s. Asterisk, this established routine, this predictability that had become so much a part of life at Willowbrook Manor, makes what happened on the evening of October 3rd, 1987, all the more remarkable. For on that crisp autumn evening, Dr. Margaret Thornfield would deviate from her routine in the most dramatic way possible. She would simply vanish, leaving behind a mystery that would puzzle investigators and capture imaginations for decades. To come dot as we prepare to explore that fateful evening. Imagine the scene, the manor settling into its evening rhythm, lights appearing in windows as residents return to their quarters, the gardens taking on the mysterious beauty that comes with dusk. And in her second-floor study, Dr. Thornfield working by lamplight, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime's research, unaware that she was about to become the central figure in one of the most baffling mysteries in the manor's long history. Asterisk October 3rd, 1987. Began much like any other autumn day at Willowbrook Manor. The morning brought a light frost that turned the manor's extensive lawns silver in the early light, and the ancient oak trees that dotted the grounds displayed their full autumn glory leaves, ranging from gold to deep burgundy rustling in the gentle breeze. Dr. Margaret Thornfield began her day as always, with her 6 o'clock walk through the gardens. Mrs. Helen Cartwright, the manor's head housekeeper and a woman who had worked at Willowbrook for over 20 years, later testified that she observed Dr. Thornfield from her office window during the morning walk. Nothing seemed unusual about the botanist's behavior or demeanor. She followed her customary route through the rose garden, around the ornamental pond, along the herb garden that she had helped design, and finally through the small woodland path that led back to the manor's main entrance. Asterisk at breakfast, served promptly at 7:30 in the manor's dining room. Dr. Thornfield took her usual place at the large oak table where the residents gathered each morning. The dining room, with its tall windows overlooking the gardens and its walls lined with portraits of the Thornfield family ancestors, had always been a place of gentle morning conversation and academic discussion. Dr. Patricia Wells, a medieval historian who had been in residence at the manor for 18 months, recalled that Dr. Thornfield seemed particularly engaged that morning. The conversation had turned to the upcoming harvest festival in the nearby village of Bramworth, and Dr. Thornfield had mentioned her interest in attending to observe the traditional decorations made from local plants and flowers. She spoke with enthusiasm about a recent letter she had received from a correspondent in Cornwall, who had shared information about a previously undocumented use for marshmallow. Asterisk Dr. Simon Blackwood, an archaeologist specializing in Romano-British settlements, sat across from Dr. Thornfield that morning. He later described her as appearing entirely normal, perhaps even more animated than usual. She had asked him about his recent discoveries at a dig site near Hadrian's Wall, showing particular interest in any evidence of Roman medicinal practices he might have uncovered. Their conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes after most of the other residents had finished their breakfast and departed for their morning's work. Following breakfast, Dr. Thornfield returned to her study as was her custom. Her route took her through the manor's grand entrance hall, up the main staircase with its worn stone steps and elegant wrought iron banister, and down the corridor to her quarters in the east wing. Several residents and staff members saw her making this familiar journey, and all would later agree that nothing about her appearance or manner suggested anything out of the ordinary. Asterisk. Dr. Thornfield's morning work session proceeded according to her established pattern. Mrs. Cartwright, making her rounds of the manor, passed by the doctor's study door around 10 o'clock and heard the familiar sounds of papers rustling and the occasional creak of the desk. Chair sounds that had become as much a part of the manor's morning symphony as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall or the distant sounds of gardening work outside Dot at 11:30. Dr. Thornfield emerged from her study for her mid-morning tea break, a ritual she rarely missed. She made her way to the manor's small kitchen, where Mrs. Cartwright had prepared a pot of Earl Grey tea and a plate of digestive biscuits. This daily interaction between the botanist and the housekeeper had become something of a friendship over the years, with Dr. Thornfield often sharing interesting details about her research while Mrs. Cartwright provided updates on manor life and village gossip. Asterisk. That morning's conversation, according to Mrs. Cartwright's detailed recollection, focused on preparations for the manor's Halloween party, an annual event that Dr. Edmund Thornfield hosted for residents and selected guests from the surrounding area. Dr. Thornfield had volunteered to create autumnal decorations using plants from the manor's gardens, and she was discussing which specimens would be most suitable for the purpose. She seemed particularly excited about incorporating some late-blooming chrysanthemums and decorative gourds from the kitchen garden. After finishing her tea, Dr. Thornfield returned to her study, where she remained until lunch was served at 1 o'clock. Lunch at Willowbrook was typically a lighter affair than breakfast or dinner, often featuring soups, salads, and sandwiches served in the manor's smaller morning room rather than the formal dining room. The atmosphere was usually quieter, as residents were often deep in their morning's work and preferred to eat quickly before returning to their studies. Dr. Thornfield sat with Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a classics professor who was working on a translation of ancient Greek texts related to agriculture and plant cultivation. Their conversation, overheard by other residents, centered on the intersection of botany and ancient literature, a topic that fascinated both scholars. Dr. Hartwell later remembered Dr. Thornfield mentioning that she planned to work late that evening, as she was approaching a breakthrough in her research on a particularly complex plant compound. The afternoon passed quietly. Dr. Thornfield spent the time in her study working on correspondence and manuscript preparation. At around 3 o'clock, she received a telephone call from Dr. James Morrison, a fellow botanist from Edinburgh University. The call lasted approximately 15 minutes, and according to Dr. Morrison's later statement, it concerned a collaborative paper they were considering on the evolution of plant medicine practices in Scotland. Dr. Thornfield sounded perfectly normal and engaged during the conversation. Asterisk. At 4:30, Dr. Thornfield made one of her regular afternoon walks through the gardens. This was observed by Thomas Weatherby, the manor's head gardener, who was preparing the flower beds for winter. Mr. Weatherby had worked with Dr. Thornfield on numerous occasions, as her research often required access to growing plants for observation and specimen collection. He noted that she stopped to examine a stand of late-blooming asters and spent several minutes making notes in the small journal she always carried during her garden walks. Their conversation, according to Mr. Weatherby, was entirely focused on garden matters. Dr. Thornfield praised the success of some experimental plantings. They had tried that spring and discussed plans for expanding the herb garden the following year. She seemed particularly interested in acquiring seeds for several varieties of medicinal plants that she had read about in historical texts, but had never seen growing. Dinner at Willowbrook Manor was served at 7 o'clock and was considered the day's primary social gathering. Residents dressed more formally for the evening meal, and the conversation was typically more wide-ranging and philosophical than at breakfast or lunch. The dining room was lit by candles and the glow from the massive stone fireplace, creating an atmosphere that encouraged reflection and intellectual discourse. Dr. Thornfield appeared for dinner wearing a deep blue dress that several residents commented on, as it was more formal than her usual attire. She seemed to be in an excellent mood, participating actively in a discussion about the relationship between scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom. Dr. Blackwood later recalled that she made several insightful comments about how modern pharmaceutical research was beginning to validate many traditional plant remedies, and she spoke passionately about the importance of preserving indigenous knowledge before it was lost. The evening's conversation was particularly engaging, touching on topics ranging from ancient healing practices to modern conservation efforts. Dr. Thornfield contributed enthusiastically, sharing stories from her field research and discussing some of the fascinating traditional remedies she had documented. She mentioned receiving a letter from a correspondent in Ireland who had provided information about a medicinal use for blackthorn that had been completely unknown to botanical science. Dr. Wells, the medieval historian, remembered Dr. Thornfield expressing excitement about a recent discovery in the manor's library. She had found a 17th century manuscript that contained detailed descriptions of plant preparations used by the estate's former inhabitants, and she was planning to spend the evening analyzing the document and comparing its contents with her own research. Dinner concluded at approximately 8:30, later than usual due to the engaging nature of the conversation. As residents began to disperse for their evening activities, Dr. Thornfield lingered in the dining room, finishing a conversation with Dr. Edmund Thornfield about the historical manuscript she had discovered. The manor's owner shared her excitement about the find and encouraged her to make use of any resources in the library that might support her research. Dr. Thornfield bid good night to her fellow residents and made her way back to her study in the East Wing. This journey, like her morning routine, was observed by several people, and all noted nothing unusual about her appearance or behavior. She carried with her a leather portfolio containing the historical manuscript and several notebooks, materials for what she expected to be a productive evening's work. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Cartwright made her evening rounds of the manor, ensuring that all residents had what they needed for the night and that the building was secure. She knocked softly on Dr. Thornfield's door to offer evening tea, a service she provided to residents who were working late. Dr. Thornfield opened the door briefly, accepted a tray containing a pot of chamomile tea and some biscuits, and mentioned that she expected to work until her usual bedtime at 10:00. Mrs. Cartwright later described Dr. Thornfield as appearing perfectly normal, perhaps a bit excited about her work, but nothing more than that. The botanist was still wearing the blue dress from dinner, though she had changed into comfortable slippers and had pinned her graying hair back in a practical style for work. Behind her, Mrs. Cartwright could see the study arranged as always, desk lamp casting a warm pool of light over scattered papers, books open on various surfaces, and specimen jars lined up on the WINDOWSILL. For the next hour. All proceeded normally. Other residents reported seeing the light in Dr. Thornfield's window and occasionally hearing the soft sounds associated with scholarly work. The turning of pages, the scratch of a pen, the gentle movement of a chair. Dr. Blackwood, whose room was in the same wing, mentioned hearing Dr. Thornfield's footsteps as she moved about her study, presumably retrieving books or specimens at 10 o'clock, as was her invariable custom. The light in Dr. Thornfield's study window went out. Dr. Wells, who was reading in the library and had a view of the East Wing, specifically noted this detail because Dr. Thornfield's punctual bedtime had become something of a manor institution. The archaeologist, Dr. Blackwood, heard what he assumed were her usual bedtime preparations: water running in the small wash basin, the sound of dresser drawers opening and closing, the general quiet movements of someone preparing for sleep. Asterisk. The manor settled into its nighttime quiet. One by one, lights in other windows went out as residents concluded their evening activities and retired for the night. By 11 o'clock, only a few lights remained on Dr. Edmund Thornfield, working late in his ground floor office, Dr. Hartwell still reading in the library, and the night lights that were kept burning in the main corridors for safety. The night passed peacefully. The manor's thick stone walls and heavy doors meant that normal nighttime sounds, the settling of old timbers, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant call of an owl were muffled and soothing rather than disturbing. Mrs. Cartwright, who lived in quarters on the ground floor, reported sleeping soundly and hearing nothing unusual during the night. Asterisk. Dawn of October 4th brought another crisp autumn morning, with mist rising from the manor's pond and a light frost covering the gardens. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Cartwright began her morning routine, starting the kitchen fires and preparing for breakfast. As she worked, she glanced out the windows toward the gardens, expecting to see Dr. Thornfield beginning her morning walk. The gardens remained empty. 6:15 passed, then 6:30. Mrs. Cartwright began to feel the first stirrings of concern. In over 3 years of residence at the manor, Dr. Thornfield had never missed her morning walk unless she was genuinely ill, and she had seemed perfectly healthy the evening before. Asterisk. At 7 o'clock, when Dr. Thornfield failed to appear for breakfast, Mrs. Cartwright decided to check on her. She climbed the stone stairs to the second floor and walked down the corridor to the botanist's quarters. Standing outside the door, she listened carefully but heard no movement inside. She knocked gently, then more firmly. When there was no response, she called out softly, asking if Dr. Thornfield was feeling well. Silenced out asterisk using her master key. Mrs. Cartwright opened the door to Dr. Thornfield's quarters. The sitting room was neat and undisturbed, exactly as it had been the previous evening. She moved through to the bedroom, expecting to find the doctor still asleep, perhaps having forgotten to set her alarm clock. The bed was empty, still made up with the same linens that Mrs. Cartwright had changed 2 days earlier. The bathroom showed no signs of recent use. Dr. Thornfield's nightgown hung on its customary hook. Her slippers sat beside the bed, and her daily clothes were laid out on a chair, as if she had prepared them for morning but had never changed into them. Asterisk. With growing alarm, Mrs. Cartwright hurried to the study. She pushed open the door and stopped, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The study appeared exactly as it had when she had delivered the evening tea tray 12 hours earlier. The historical manuscript lay open on the desk, Dr. Thornfield's reading glasses beside it, her fountain pen uncapped as if she had just set it down. The chamomile tea sat cold in its cup, barely touched, and the biscuits remained untouched on their plate. But Dr. Margaret Thornfield was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Cartwright's immediate thought was that perhaps the doctor had risen early and gone for an extended walk, though this would have been completely out of character. She hurried back downstairs and enlisted the help of Thomas Weatherby, asking him to search the gardens and grounds, while she checked the rest of the manor building. The search was thorough and systematic. Every room in the manor was examined, from the grand reception rooms on the ground floor to the storage areas in the basement. The library, the conservatory, the kitchen, the dining rooms, all were empty. Dr. Thornfield was not in the building. Meanwhile, Mr. Weatherby searched the extensive grounds of Willowbrook Manor. He checked the gardens, the greenhouse, the small chapel on the estate, even the old stable buildings that had been converted to storage. He walked the woodland paths, examined the ornamental pond, and checked the summer house where residents sometimes went to read on pleasant days. He found no trace of Dr. Thornfield anywhere on the property. By this time, other residents had begun to gather, alerted by the unusual activity. Dr. Edmund Thornfield was summoned from his morning correspondence, and he immediately joined the search. The manor's small staff was assembled, and every possible location was systematically examined. Dr. Blackwood, the archaeologist, made a crucial observation. He noted that Dr. Thornfield's door had been locked from the outside when Mrs. Cartwright found it. The key to her quarters was still in Dr. Thornfield's possession. It was found on her dresser, where she customarily left it each night. This meant that the door had been locked using Mrs. Cartwright's master key, something that should only have happened if Dr. Thornfield had requested it, or if someone with access to the master keys had locked her in. Asterisk. An examination of Dr. Thornfield's study revealed several puzzling details. Her work appeared to have been interrupted mid-sentence. She had been writing notes about the historical manuscript, and the final sentence stopped abruptly in the middle of a word. Her reading glasses lay beside the open manuscript as if she had just removed them to rest her eyes. The fountain pen was uncapped, with ink still wet on the nib, suggesting it had been set down very recently. Most puzzling of all, the study's window was closed and latched from the inside. The window faced the manor's garden and was on the second floor, approximately 15 feet above the ground. Even if someone had managed to climb down from the window, they would have had to latch it from inside the room before descending. A physical impossibility. By 9 o'clock that morning, it had become clear that Dr. Margaret Thornfield had vanished completely from a locked room, leaving behind no indication of where she had gone or how she had managed to leave. Her personal belongings remained untouched. Her work lay interrupted, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment, and there was no sign of struggle or disturbance anywhere. In her quarters, Dr. Edmund Thornfield made the decision to contact the local police. Within an hour, Detective Inspector Robert Chenley of the North Yorkshire Police arrived at Willowbrook Manor to begin what would become one of the most baffling investigations of his career. Asterisk. As Inspector Chenley began his preliminary examination of the scene, one fact became immediately apparent. Dr. Margaret Thornfield had somehow vanished from a locked room on the second floor of a secure building, leaving behind a mystery that seemed to defy logical explanation. The investigation that followed would uncover intriguing theories, surprising connections, and fascinating possibilities, but it would never provide a definitive answer to the central question: what happened to Dr. Margaret Thornfield on the night of October 3, 1987? Asterisk. Detective Inspector Robert Chenley was a methodical man with over 20 years of experience in criminal investigation. At 53, he had seen enough mysteries to know that even the most baffling cases usually had mundane explanations once all the facts were uncovered. However, as he stood in Dr. Margaret Thornfield's study on that October morning, examining the scene of her disappearance, he felt the peculiar mixture of fascination and frustration that would define the months of investigation to follow. Inspector Chenley's first task was to secure the scene and establish a timeline of events. Working with Dr. Edmund Thornfield and Mrs. Cartwright, he meticulously documented every detail of the missing woman's last known activities. The timeline that emerged was remarkably precise, thanks to the structured nature of life at Willowbrook Manor and the observant nature of its residents and staff. Asterisk. The inspector's initial examination of Dr. Thornfield's quarters revealed several immediately apparent facts that would prove central to the investigation. First, there was absolutely no sign of struggle or disturbance. The study appeared exactly as it would if its occupant had simply stepped out for a moment, intending to return shortly. Second, all of Dr. Thornfield's personal belongings remained. In place, her clothing, jewelry, money, and identification documents were all accounted for. Third, and most puzzling, the room appeared to be secured from within, with no obvious means of exit available. Inspector Chenley called for a forensics team from York, and by midday, specialists were examining every surface in Dr. Thornfield's quarters for fingerprints, hair samples, and any other physical evidence that might explain her disappearance. The examination was thorough and professional, but it yielded little useful information. The fingerprints found in the room belonged exclusively to Dr. Thornfield, Mrs. Cartwright, and occasionally other residents who had visited for academic discussions. Asterisk. The physical examination of the study proved particularly intriguing. The window, as noted earlier, was latched from the inside and showed no signs of tampering. The inspector examined it personally, confirming that it would be impossible for someone to exit through the window and then secure it from outside. Window frame was original to the 1743 construction of the manor, with thick stone sills and heavy wooden frames that had been recently maintained, but showed normal signs of age and weather. Below the window, the garden showed no evidence of disturbance. The soft earth of the flower bed directly beneath would have clearly shown footprints or signs of impact if someone had dropped or climbed down from the window. Mr. Weatherby, the gardener, confirmed that he had worked in that specific area the previous afternoon and could verify that the soil had been undisturbed since then. Asterisk. The door to Koko. Dr. Thornfield's quarters presented another puzzle. Mrs. Cartwright confirmed that she had locked it with her master key the previous evening after delivering the tea tray, following Dr. Thornfield's request for privacy during her work session. The door had definitely been locked when Mrs. Cartwright tried to enter that morning, requiring her to use the master key. Yet Dr. Thornfield's personal key to the room was found on her dresser, in its customary location. Inspector Chenley tested the door mechanism personally and confirmed that it could only be locked from the outside using a key. There was no way to lock the door from inside the room, a security feature that Dr. Edmund Thornfield explained had been designed to prevent residents from accidentally locking themselves in their quarters. Asterisk. The examination of Dr. Thornfield's interrupted work provided fascinating insights into her activities during her final evening at the manor. The historical manuscript she had been studying was a 17th century document titled Herbal Remedies and Natural Philosophies of the Thornfield Estate, written by one Margot Thornfield, the wife of the manor's third owner. The manuscript, discovered in the manor's library just days earlier, contained detailed descriptions of medicinal plant preparations and their applications. Dr. Thornfield's notes, written in her characteristic precise handwriting, showed that she had been comparing the historical remedies with modern botanical knowledge. Her final written words were particularly intriguing. The morning glory preparation described here matches exactly the compound mentioned in the Celtic manuscript from. The sentence ended abruptly, with the pen apparently set down mid-word. Asterisk. Inspector Chenley spent considerable time examining this interrupted sentence and the circumstances surrounding it. The ink was still slightly wet when the scene was discovered, suggesting that Dr. Thornfield had been writing very recently before her disappearance. The positioning of her reading glasses and the uncapped fountain pen indicated that she had paused in her work suddenly, as if distracted or interrupted by something. The chamomile tea that Mrs. Cartwright had delivered remained largely untouched, with only a few sips taken from the cup. The biscuits were completely untouched. This was unusual, as Dr. Thornfield was known to enjoy her evening tea and rarely left food uneaten. The tea was tested for any unusual substances, but laboratory analysis revealed nothing more than ordinary chamomile, milk, and sugar. Asterisk. The investigation expanded to include interviews with all residents and staff of Willowbrook Manor. Each person was questioned extensively about their activities on the evening of October 3rd and their observations of Dr. Thornfield's behavior and demeanor. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a woman who had appeared entirely normal, engaged in her work, and looking forward to future projects. Dr. Patricia Wells, the medieval historian, provided particularly detailed testimony. She had been one of the last people to see Dr. Thornfield before her disappearance, and she described their dinner conversation in great detail. According to Dr. Wells, Dr. Thornfield had seemed excited about her research discoveries and had mentioned looking forward to corresponding with a colleague in Ireland about traditional plant remedies. That Dr. Simon Blackwood's testimony proved especially valuable due to his room's proximity to Dr. Thornfield's quarters. He provided the most detailed account of the sounds he had heard from her study during the evening. According to his statement, the sounds had been entirely consistent with normal scholarly work until approximately 9:45 p.m., when he had heard what he described as a brief scraping sound, like a chair being moved quickly. This detail intrigued Inspector Chenley, as it suggested that something had happened in Dr. Thornfield's study shortly before her customary bedtime. However, Dr. Blackwood admitted that the sound had been so brief and subtle that he had paid little attention to it at the time, assuming it was simply part of Dr. Thornfield's normal evening routine. Mrs. Helen Cartwright underwent the most extensive questioning, as she had been the last person known to have seen Dr. Thornfield alive. Her testimony was remarkably detailed and consistent across multiple interviews. She described Dr. Thornfield's appearance, behavior, and mood with precision, noting particularly that the botanist had seemed perhaps more animated than usual. When discussing her research discoveries, the housekeeper's description of the study when she delivered the evening tea proved crucial to establishing the scene. According to Mrs. Cartwright, the room had been arranged exactly as it was found the following morning, with the historical manuscript open on the desk, research notes scattered about, and various botanical reference books open to relevant pages. Investigation expanded beyond the manor itself to examine Dr. Thornfield's broader life and relationships. Inspector Chenley contacted her professional colleagues, her few remaining family members, and her extensive network of correspondence throughout the British Isles and Europe. This phase of the investigation revealed a woman who was deeply respected in academic circles but lived a remarkably quiet and private personal life. Dr. James Morrison, from Edinburgh University, who had spoken with Dr. Thornfield by telephone on the afternoon before her disappearance, confirmed that she had seemed entirely normal during their conversation. Their discussion had focused on a potential collaborative research project, and Dr. Morrison described her as engaged, enthusiastic, and looking forward to future work. The examination of Dr. Thornfield's correspondence files revealed hundreds of letters from botanists, historians, and amateur plant enthusiasts across Europe. Inspector Chenley and his team read through months of correspondence, looking for any indication of personal problems, professional conflicts, or unusual relationships that might explain her disappearance. The letters painted a picture of a woman deeply engaged with her work and generous in sharing knowledge with others. Many correspondents wrote to thank her for advice or information she had provided, and several mentioned looking forward to the publication of her encyclopedia. There were no angry letters, no threats, no indications of any kind of conflict or controversy in her professional life. One particularly intriguing aspect of the correspondence investigation involved Dr. Thornfield's exchange of letters with a Mrs. Bridget O'Connor from County Cork, Ireland. Mrs. O'Connor had been providing Dr. Thornfield with information about traditional Irish plant remedies, and their correspondence had become quite extensive over the previous year. The most recent letter from Mrs. O'Connor, received just 3 days before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, contained detailed information about traditional preparations using morning glory flowers. This was particularly interesting because Dr. Thornfield's final written notes had mentioned morning glory preparations, suggesting that Mrs. O'Connor's information had been directly relevant to her. Evening's research. Inspector Chenley arranged to telephone Mrs. O'Connor in Ireland to discuss her correspondence with Dr. Thornfield. Conversation revealed an elderly woman who had developed a genuine fondness for the English botanist. Through their letter exchanges, Mrs. O'Connor expressed shock and concern about Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and offered any assistance she could provide to the investigation. According to Mrs. O'Connor, Dr. Thornfield had written to her just a week before her disappearance, expressing excitement about some research breakthrough she had made by comparing historical manuscripts with traditional knowledge. Dr. Thornfield had mentioned finding connections between different cultural traditions that no previous researcher had identified, and she had seemed particularly eager to continue this line of investigation. The financial investigation revealed no irregularities or concerns. Dr. Thornfield lived modestly on her pension and savings, with no debts or financial problems. Her bank account showed regular, predictable transactions consistent with her quiet lifestyle at the manor. There had been no unusual withdrawals, no large purchases, nothing to suggest she had been planning any kind of departure. Her will, updated just 6 months earlier, left her modest estate to various botanical charities and research institutions. The will made no mention of any personal relationships outside her professional circles and contained no unusual provisions that might indicate she had been planning to disappear. Asterisk. The investigation of the manor's library, where Dr. Thornfield had discovered the 17th century manuscript, revealed several interesting details. Dr. Edmund Thornfield explained that the manuscript had been found in a collection of family papers that had recently been donated to the manor by a distant relative. The papers had been stored in the library's archive room, and Dr. Thornfield had been given permission to examine them as part of her research. The manuscript itself was examined by experts from Cambridge University, who confirmed its authenticity and historical significance. The document contained remarkably detailed information about medicinal plant preparations used on the estate during the 1600s, much of it consistent with traditional knowledge that had been passed down through oral tradition. Asterisk. What made the manuscript particularly intriguing was its author, Margot Thornfield. According to family records, Margot had been known as something of an herbalist and healer, consulted by local people for various ailments. She had apparently compiled the manuscript as a reference for her own use and for future generations, though it had remained in the family's private collection for centuries. The coincidence of names. Dr. Margaret Thornfield researching a manuscript written by Margot Thornfield was noted by the investigators, though no family connection between the two women could be established. Dr. Edmund Thornfield confirmed that his research into family genealogy had found no relationship between the manor's founding family and Dr. Thornfield's lineage. 3 weeks into the investigation, Inspector Chenley faced a dilemma that would become increasingly familiar as the case progressed. Every conventional avenue of investigation had been thoroughly explored, yet no credible explanation for Dr. Thornfield's disappearance had emerged. She had vanished from a locked room with no apparent means of exit, leaving behind no trace of where she had gone or why she had left. The inspector consulted with colleagues who had experience with missing persons cases, but Dr. Thornfield's disappearance didn't fit any of the usual patterns. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication of personal problems that might have motivated her to leave voluntarily, and no physical explanation for how she could have departed from her secured quarters. A case review meeting was held at police headquarters in York, bringing together Inspector Chenley, his sergeant, the forensics team, and senior detectives with experience in unusual cases. The consensus was that the investigation had been thorough and professional, but that the facts of the case seemed to defy conventional explanation. Sergeant Patricia Moore, Inspector Chenley's most experienced colleague, raised the possibility that they were dealing with an elaborate deception of some kind. Perhaps Dr. Thornfield had staged her own disappearance for reasons unknown. finding some way to leave the locked room that had not yet been discovered. This theory was explored extensively, but no evidence supporting it could be found. The physical search of Willowbrook Manor was expanded to include areas that had not been thoroughly examined during the initial investigation. A team of specialists searched the manor's basement, its attic spaces, and even examined the walls and floors for hidden passages or concealed rooms that might explain Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. This expanded search revealed the fascinating architectural history of the manor, but no hidden passages or secret rooms. The building had been constructed and renovated over several centuries, and there were indeed some sealed doorways and unused spaces, but none that could have provided a means of escape from Dr. Thornfield's second-floor quarters. Electronic detection equipment was brought in to scan the walls and floors of Dr. Thornfield's study for any concealed openings or structural anomalies. The scanning revealed the normal construction features of an 18th century building that had undergone various renovations, but nothing that could explain a mysterious disappearance. The window and its frame were examined by specialists, who confirmed that there was no conceivable way for someone to exit through the window and then secure it from inside the room. The latching mechanism was simple but effective, and there were no signs that it had been tampered with or modified in any way. 4 months after Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, Inspector Chenley compiled his final report on the investigation. The report documented every aspect of the case in meticulous detail, from the timeline of events to the physical evidence, from the interviews with witnesses to the various theories that had been explored. The conclusion was both thorough and unsatisfying. Dr. Margaret Thornfield had disappeared under circumstances that could not be explained through conventional investigation methods. The case officially remained open as missing persons cases, but active investigation was suspended due to lack of new leads or evidence. Inspector Chenley later described the Thornfield case as the most baffling of his career, a mystery that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how crimes occur and how they can be solved. In the months following the suspension of active investigation, Inspector Chenley continued to think about the case during his off-duty hours. He would sometimes drive out to Willowbrook Manor on weekend afternoons, walking through the gardens and examining the exterior of the building, hoping that a fresh perspective might reveal some detail that had been overlooked. Dr. Edmund Thornfield always welcomed these informal visits, and the two men would discuss the case over tea in the manor's library. Dr. Thornfield shared Inspector Chenley's frustration with the lack of resolution, particularly because Dr. Thornfield's disappearance had deeply affected the manor's community of scholars. Several residents had left following the incident, finding it impossible to concentrate on their work while the mystery remained unsolved. The investigation had one unexpected consequence. It brought national attention to Willowbrook Manor and to Dr. Thornfield's research. Several newspapers picked up the story of the vanishing botanist, and her partially completed encyclopedia became the subject of considerable academic interest. Cambridge University Press approached Dr. Edmund Thornfield about the possibility of publishing Dr. Thornfield's manuscript in its current form, with additional material contributed by her colleagues and correspondents. This attention also led to an influx of amateur investigators and curiosity seekers, people who were intrigued by the mystery and convinced they could succeed where professional investigators had failed. Dr. Edmund Thornfield found it necessary to restrict access to the manor and to Dr. Thornfield's former quarters, which had been kept exactly as they were found on the morning of her disappearance. 1 year after the disappearance, Inspector Chenley made what would be his final official visit to Willowbrook Manor. He spent several hours re-examining Dr. Thornfield's quarters, looking through her papers and belongings with the benefit of 12 months' perspective on the case. The study remained a perfect snapshot of scholarly work interrupted, a tableau that continued to resist explanation. Standing in the quiet study, looking out the window at the gardens where Dr. Thornfield had walked every morning for over 3 years. Inspector Chenley found himself wondering if perhaps the mystery was not meant to be solved. Some cases, he reflected, seemed to belong more to the realm of legend than to police files, and Dr. Thornfield's disappearance might be one of them. The official investigation of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance concluded without resolution, leaving behind a mystery that would continue to intrigue and puzzle anyone who learned of it. The facts were clear and well documented. The investigation had been thorough and professional, but the central question remained unanswered. What had happened to Dr. Margaret Thornfield on the night of October 3, 1987? As Inspector Chenley closed his final report and filed it away, he knew that this case would stay with him for the rest of his career. It had challenged everything he thought he knew about investigation and evidence, about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. And in the years that followed, as the story of the vanishing botanist spread beyond official police channels into the realm of folklore and speculation, it would challenge others in exactly the same way. In the years following Dr. Margaret Thornfield's mysterious disappearance from Willowbrook Manor, the case attracted the attention of investigators, academics, journalists, and amateur sleuths from around the world. Each brought their own perspective to the puzzle, and over time, several distinct theories emerged to explain what might have happened on that October evening in 1987. The theories ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary, from carefully reasoned academic hypotheses to wild speculation that stretched the boundaries of credibility. Yet each theory, no matter how conventional or fantastical, attempted to address the central mystery. How could a woman vanish completely from a locked room, leaving no trace of her departure? The most conventional explanation suggested that Dr. Thornfield had orchestrated her own disappearance for unknown personal reasons. Proponents of this theory argued that her apparent contentment and normal behavior on her final day could have been an elaborate performance, designed to deflect suspicion from a carefully planned vanishing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who studied the case extensively, proposed that Dr. Thornfield might have been suffering from a form of depression or anxiety that she had successfully concealed from others. According to this theory, the pressure of completing her life's work, combined with the isolation of her scholarly life, could have led to a psychological crisis that manifested as a desire to simply disappear and start over somewhere else. Voluntary disappearance theory required explaining how Dr. Thornfield could have left her locked quarters without detection. Dr. Mitchell suggested that the botanist, with her detailed knowledge of the manor and its routines, might have discovered some method of exit that was unknown to others. Perhaps she had found a way to manipulate the door lock from inside, or had identified some architectural feature that provided an alternative route out of the building. However, this theory faced significant challenges. The forensic examination of Dr. Thornfield's room had been extraordinarily thorough, and no method of secret exit had been discovered. Additionally, her financial records showed no preparation for departure, no unusual withdrawals, no liquidated assets, no purchases. That would suggest she had been planning to leave. Her passport remained in her room, and there was no evidence that she had established an alternative identity or made arrangements for life elsewhere. A second conventional theory proposed that Dr. Thornfield had suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency that explained her disappearance. Professor David Hartley, a retired physician who became fascinated with the case, suggested that Dr. Thornfield might have experienced a sudden onset of confusion or disorientation that caused her to wander away from the manor. According to this theory, Dr. Thornfield could have left her study in a confused state, perhaps forgetting to take her key or properly secure her door. She might then have wandered outside into the October night and suffered an accident, somewhere on the manor's extensive grounds or in the surrounding countryside. Professor Hartley pointed to several medical conditions that could cause sudden disorientation in elderly people, minor strokes, blood sugar fluctuations, or adverse reactions to medication. Any of these could have caused Dr. Thornfield to behave in ways that were completely out of character, including leaving her quarters in the middle of her work session. The accident theory also faced significant obstacles. The search of the manors. Grounds had been exhaustive, conducted by experienced searchers who knew the terrain well. Additional searches in the months following her disappearance had covered an ever-widening area around the manor, including streams, woodland, and abandoned buildings. No trace of Dr. Thornfield had ever been found. Asterisk. One of the most intriguing theories emerged from Dr. Thornfield's own research. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the classics professor who had been at the manor during Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, spent months studying the historical manuscript that the botanist had been examining on her final evening. Dr. Hartwell discovered that Margot Thornfield, the 17th century author of the manuscript, had herself disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1682. According to family records, Margot had been working late in her study when she simply vanished, leaving behind her work and personal belongings. The circumstances, while not identical to Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance, were remarkably similar. This discovery led Dr. Hartwell to propose what she called the historical parallel theory. She suggested that there might be something about the specific location Dr. Thornfield studied, which had been Margot Thornfield's workspace centuries earlier, that was connected to both disappearances. Perhaps some environmental factor, some undiscovered architectural feature, or some other element specific to that room had played a role in both events. Dr. Hartwell's research revealed that the room had served as a study or workspace for various members of the Thornfield family throughout the manor's history. She found references to several other mysterious incidents associated with the room, though none as dramatic as the two documented disappearances. Asterisk. The historical parallel theory attracted considerable academic interest, particularly among historians and folklorists who were fascinated by the apparent repetition of mysterious events across centuries. However, it offered no concrete explanation for how the disappearances had occurred, serving more as an intriguing observation than a practical solution to the mystery. Amateur investigator Martin Blackstone spent 2 years researching the architectural history of Willowbrook Manor, convinced that the building contained hidden passages that explained Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. His theory was based on the assumption that a house of the manor's age and complexity must contain secret roots that had been forgotten over the centuries. Blackstone's research into the manor's construction revealed that it had been built by the same architectural firm that had designed several other great houses in Yorkshire, some of which were known to contain priest holes and hidden passages dating from periods of religious persecution. He argued that Willowbrook Manor almost certainly contained similar features that had simply been lost to memory. According to Blackstone's theory, Dr. Thornfield had somehow discovered one of these hidden passages and used it to leave the manor, either voluntarily or under duress. The passage might have been concealed behind bookcases, within the walls themselves, or accessed through some other concealed mechanism that would not be apparent to casual observers. Blackstone's enthusiasm led to several unofficial searches of the manor, conducted with Dr. Edmund Thornfield's permission, but without professional archaeological supervision. These searches identified several interesting architectural features: sealed doorways, unusual wall construction, areas where the building's layout seemed irregular, but no hidden passages that could explain Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Professional archaeologists who later examined Blackstone's findings confirmed that while the manor did contain some unusual architectural features, there was no evidence of concealed passages connecting to Dr. Thornfield's quarters. The room had been thoroughly examined using modern detection equipment, and no hidden exits had been found. Dr. James Morrison, the Edinburgh botanist who had spoken with Dr. Thornfield on the afternoon before her disappearance, proposed a theory based on her research into psychoactive plants. Dr. Morrison knew that Dr. Thornfield's work had occasionally touched on plants with mind-altering properties, and he wondered if her research might have led to an accidental poisoning or induced altered state. According to this theory, Dr. Thornfield might have been experimenting with plant compounds described in the historical manuscript, possibly trying to recreate preparations that had been used centuries earlier. If she had inadvertently consumed or been exposed to a psychoactive substance, it could have caused hallucinations, disorientation, or other altered mental states that led to her disappearance. Dr. Morrison pointed out that several of the plants mentioned in Margot Thornfield's manuscript were known to have psychoactive properties when prepared in certain ways. Morning glory seeds, for example, contain compounds similar to LSD when processed correctly. If Dr. Margaret Thornfield had been trying to understand these historical preparations through direct experimentation, she might have unknowingly affected her own mental state. The botanical experiment theory suggested that Dr. Thornfield, under the influence of plant-derived compounds, might have left her study in a confused or hallucinating state. She could have wandered away from the manor and met with some accident, or might have hidden herself somewhere while under the influence of the substances. However, this theory faced the same evidentiary problems as the accident theory. No trace of experimental plant preparations was found in Dr. Thornfield's study, and the toxicology analysis of her untouched tea had revealed nothing unusual. Additionally, her final written notes showed no signs of confusion or altered thinking. Her handwriting remained precise and her observations coherent right up to the point where her sentence was interrupted. As news of Dr. Thornfield's disappearance spread beyond academic and investigative circles, it inevitably attracted the attention of people interested in supernatural explanations. The mysterious nature of her vanishing, combined with the historical precedent of Margot Thornfield's similar disappearance, led some to propose theories involving ghosts, time slips, parallel dimensions, and other paranormal phenomena. Mrs. Violet Ashworth, a local historian with an interest in folklore, suggested that the Thornfield family had always been associated with unusual occurrences. Her research into local legends revealed stories of family members who had possessed unusual knowledge of plants and their properties, some of whom were rumored to have practiced forms of natural magic or herbalism that went beyond conventional medicine. According to Mrs. Ashworth's theory, Dr. Margaret Thornfield's intensive research into historical plant preparations had somehow connected her with forces or knowledge that transcended normal reality. Perhaps her work with Margot Thornfield's manuscript had opened some kind of supernatural doorway, allowing her to step out of ordinary time and space. The supernatural theory gained additional support from reports of unusual experiences at Willowbrook Manor following Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Several residents claimed to have heard footsteps in the corridors at night, to have seen lights in Dr. Thornfield's former study when it was supposed to be empty, and to have caught glimpses of a figure walking in the gardens during the early morning hours. While these reports were intriguing, they could not be verified objectively. Dr. Edmund Thornfield acknowledged that the manor had always been subject to the usual sounds and optical illusions common to old buildings, and he suggested that the heightened awareness following Dr. Thornfield's disappearance had made residents more likely to notice and report ordinary phenomena. A more elaborate theory emerged from investigative journalist Rebecca Stone, who spent 6 months researching Dr. Thornfield's professional relationships and academic work. Stone proposed that the disappearance was connected to Dr. Thornfield's research into medicinal plants, possibly involving valuable pharmaceutical discoveries that had attracted unwanted attention. According to Stone's theory, Dr. Thornfield's work on traditional plant medicines had led her to identify compounds with significant commercial potential. Perhaps her research had uncovered the basis for new medications, and her disappearance was the result of corporate espionage or academic theft on an unprecedented scale. Stones. Investigation revealed that pharmaceutical companies were indeed showing increased interest in traditional plant medicines during the 1980s as they sought new sources for drug development. She suggested that Dr. Thornfield's extensive correspondence network and her reputation for discovering unusual plant applications could have made her a target for corporate intelligence gathering. The conspiracy theory proposed that Dr. Thornfield had been kidnapped by agents working for pharmaceutical companies who wanted to obtain her research and prevent her from publishing discoveries that could be developed commercially. The locked room mystery was explained as an elaborate deception designed to make her disappearance appear supernatural or impossible to solve. However, Stone's investigation found no concrete evidence supporting the conspiracy theory. Dr. Thornfield's research, while academically valuable, showed no signs of leading toward commercially viable pharmaceutical discoveries. Her correspondence revealed no contacts with pharmaceutical companies, and her work appeared to be purely academic in nature. Perhaps the most extraordinary theory came from Dr. Michael Chun, a theoretical physicist who became interested in the case through his friendship with one of Willowbrook Manor's residents. Dr. Chun proposed that Dr. Thornfield's disappearance might be explained by what he called temporal displacement, a slip in time that transported her from 1987 to some other period. According to Dr. Chun's theory, certain locations might be subject to temporal anomalies that could cause people or objects to move between different time periods. He suggested that Dr. Thornfield's study, particularly given its history of mysterious disappearances, might be located at one of these temporal weak points. Dr. Chun's theory attempted to explain both the method and the means of Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. If she had been transported to a different time period, it would explain why no trace of her could be found in 1987. She would simply no longer exist in that temporal framework. The locked room mystery would be solved because she hadn't actually left the room in any conventional sense. She had been displaced temporally rather than spatially. The time displacement theory also provided an explanation for the historical parallel with Margot Thornfield's disappearance. Perhaps the two women had both been affected by the same temporal anomaly, transported to different time periods by the same mysterious force. While Dr. Chun's theory was intellectually fascinating, it remained purely speculative. There was no scientific evidence for the existence of temporal anomalies, and no way to test whether such phenomena had played a role in Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The theory belonged more to the realm of science fiction than to practical. Investigation. Dr. Angela Whitmore, a Jungian psychologist, proposed a theory based on Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. She suggested that Dr. Thornfield's intensive research into traditional plant knowledge had somehow connected her with deeper layers of human consciousness, leading to her disappearance through psychological rather than physical means. According to Dr. Whitmore's theory, Dr. Thornfield's work with historical manuscripts and traditional plant wisdom had put her in contact with archetypal knowledge that existed in the collective unconscious of humanity. Her disappearance represented a kind of psychological dissolution, where her individual consciousness had merged with these deeper patterns of human experience. The collective unconscious theory attempted to explain the mystery in psychological terms while acknowledging its apparently supernatural aspects. Dr. Whitmore suggested that consciousness might be less individual and more collective than normally assumed, and that under certain circumstances, people could step outside their individual identities and merge with larger patterns of human experience. This theory, like the supernatural and time displacement theories, could not be tested or verified through conventional investigation methods. It remained an interesting philosophical speculation about the nature of consciousness and reality, but offered no practical explanation for the physical facts of Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. As the years passed and new theories continued to emerge, the case of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance became something more than a simple missing persons investigation. It became a modern mystery that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, identity, and the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Each theory, whether mundane or extraordinary, reflected the worldview and expertise of its proponent. Conventional investigators focused on practical explanations involving deception, accident, or crime. Academics looked for historical parallels and scholarly connections. Those inclined toward supernatural explanations found evidence of otherworldly forces. Scientists proposed theoretical frameworks involving time, space, and consciousness. Yet despite the creativity and passion that investigators brought to the case, none of the theories provided a completely satisfying explanation for what had happened to Dr. Margaret Thornfield on that October evening in 1987. Each theory could account for some aspects of the mystery, while leaving others unexplained. Each offered a possible solution while raising new questions, and so the case remained precisely what it had been from the beginning. A mystery that seemed to exist at the intersection of the known and the unknown, challenging anyone who encountered it to question their assumptions about the nature of reality itself. 25 years have passed since Dr. Margaret Thornfield vanished from her study at Willowbrook Manor on that autumn evening in 1987. The mystery that began with a simple failure to appear for morning breakfast has become something much larger, a modern legend that continues to intrigue investigators, academics, and casual observers from around the world. Willowbrook Manor still stands in its Yorkshire Valley, though it has changed considerably since Dr. Thornfield's time. Dr. Edmund Thornfield, now in his 80s, continues to oversee the residential research facility, but the manor's character has been inevitably altered by its association with the unsolved mystery. The building that once provided a quiet retreat for scholarly work has become, despite its owner's best efforts, something of a pilgrimage site for people fascinated by unexplained disappearances. The room that was Dr. Thornfield's study has been preserved exactly as it was found on October 4th, 1987. Dr. Edmund Thornfield made the decision early on to maintain the space as a kind of shrine to the missing botanist, partly out of respect for her memory and partly in the hope that some detail in the unchanged room might eventually provide a clue to her disappearance. Visitors to the room, and there are many, despite the manor's attempts to maintain its academic atmosphere, often comment on the eerie sense of interruption that pervades the space. The open manuscript on the desk, the uncapped fountain pen, the barely touched cup of tea, all create the impression that Dr. Thornfield has simply stepped away for a moment and might return at any time to complete her interrupted sentence. Historical manuscript that Dr. Thornfield had been studying on her final evening has itself become the subject of extensive research. Scholars from Cambridge, Oxford, and universities across Europe have examined Margot Thornfield's 17th century work, not only for its historical value but also for any clues it might contain about Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance. The manuscript has yielded fascinating insights into the medicinal plant knowledge of the 1600s, confirming much of what modern ethnobotanists had theorized about traditional healing practices. However, it has provided no clear explanation for why two women, separated by 3 centuries, should have disappeared under similar circumstances while studying the same document. Dr. Thornfield's encyclopedia project, her life's work that remained unfinished at the time of her disappearance, was eventually completed by a team of her colleagues and published by Cambridge University Press in 1991. The published work, British Medicinal Plants, Traditional Knowledge and Scientific Understanding, became a standard reference in ethnobotanical studies and was dedicated to Dr. Thornfield's memory. The encyclopedia's completion required extensive research into Dr. Thornfield's notes and correspondence files, work that revealed the remarkable scope of her knowledge and the meticulous nature of her research methods. Yet this detailed examination of her work provided no new insights into her disappearance, serving only to reinforce the impression of a dedicated scholar who had no apparent reason to abandon her life's work so close to its completion. Inspector Robert Chenley retired from the North Yorkshire Police in 1995, but he never stopped thinking about the Thornfield case. In retirement, he wrote extensively about his experiences as a detective, devoting an entire chapter of his memoir to the unsolved mystery. He described the case as a humbling reminder that not all puzzles have solutions, and that the world contains mysteries that may forever remain beyond human understanding. In his memoir, published in 1998, Inspector Chenley reflected on how the Thornfield case had changed his perspective on police work and investigation. For 30 years, he wrote, I believed that every mystery had a solution, that every question had an answer if you just looked hard enough and long enough. Dr. Thornfield's disappearance taught me that this may not always be true. Some mysteries may exist not to be solved, but to remind us that the world is stranger and more complex than we imagine. The inspector's final visit to Willowbrook Manor took place in 2001, 14 years after Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. He found the manor much changed, with security measures that reflected its unwanted fame and a constant stream of visitors that Dr. Edmund Thornfield managed with weary patience. Yet Dr. Thornfield's study remained exactly as it had been left, a frozen moment in time that continued to resist explanation. Mrs. Helen Cartwright, the housekeeper who had discovered Dr. Thornfield's absence, remained at Willowbrook Manor until her retirement in 2000. In interviews conducted years later, she maintained that she could offer no new insights into the mystery, but admitted that she had never stopped wondering what had happened during those crucial hours between her evening tea delivery and the morning discovery. I've gone over that evening 1,000 times in my mind, Mrs. Cartwright said in a 2005 interview. Dr. Thornfield seemed perfectly normal, perhaps a bit excited about her research, but certainly not like someone who was planning to disappear. I keep thinking there must have been some sign, some detail I missed, but if there was, I still haven't found it. The manor's gardens, which had been Dr. Thornfield's daily inspiration and the source of many of her research specimens, continue to flourish under the care of successive head gardeners. Thomas Weatherby, who had worked closely with Dr. Thornfield on various botanical projects, remained at the manor until his retirement in 1995. He often spoke of missing their morning conversations and her enthusiasm for discovering new applications. For familiar plants, a memorial garden was established in Dr. Thornfield's honor in 1992, located in a quiet corner of the manor grounds, where she had often walked during her morning routines. The garden features many of the medicinal plants that were central to her research, arranged according to a design found among her papers. A simple stone bench bears an inscription, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, 1925 to 1987, who sought wisdom in the ancient knowledge of plants. The question mark after the year of her presumed death reflects the enduring uncertainty about Dr. Thornfield's fate. Legally, she was declared dead in 1994, 7 years after her disappearance, but the absence of any physical evidence means that questions about what actually happened to her remain unanswered. Her few living relatives, distant cousins who had had little contact with her during her lifetime, accepted the legal declaration of death and settled her modest estate according to her will. The botanical charities and research institutions that benefited from her bequests established several fellowships and research funds in her name, ensuring that her commitment to the study of traditional plant knowledge would continue. Asterisk, the official police file on Dr. Thornfield's disappearance remains open, as is standard practice with unsolved missing persons cases. However, active investigations ceased long ago, and the file now serves primarily as a historical document, consulted occasionally by criminology students, mystery writers, and the persistent amateur investigators who continue to propose new theories about what might have happened. Detective Sergeant Patricia Moore, who worked closely with Inspector Chenley on the original investigation, eventually became a detective inspector herself and handled numerous missing persons cases throughout her career. She often reflected that none of them ever approached the sheer inexplicability of the Thornfield case. Most missing persons cases resolve themselves eventually. Detective Inspector Moore observed in a 2010 interview, "People turn up, or evidence emerges that explains what happened to them. Bodies are found, witnesses come forward, new information surfaces. But Dr. Thornfield's case has remained as mysterious today as it was 23 years ago. It's as if she simply stepped out of our reality and into something else entirely." The academic community that had known and respected Dr. Thornfield gradually adapted to her absence, though her influence on the field of ethnobotany continued through her published works and the scholars she had mentored and corresponded with during her career. Several international conferences on traditional plant knowledge have been held in her honor, and her approach to combining rigorous scientific method with respect for traditional wisdom has become a standard model for researchers in the field. Dr. Patricia Wells, the medieval historian who had been one of the last people to see Dr. Thornfield before her disappearance, completed her own research project at Willowbrook Manor and left the institution in 1989. However, she maintained her interest in the mystery and eventually wrote a scholarly article examining the historical parallels between Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance and similar mysterious vanishings throughout British history. Dr. Wells's research revealed that unexplained disappearances from country houses and academic institutions had been reported sporadically throughout the centuries, often involving scholars or researchers who had been working on projects related to traditional knowledge, folklore, or historical mysteries. While she could establish no definitive connections between these cases, the patterns she identified added another layer of intrigue to an already fascinating mystery. The Thornfield case has inspired numerous works of fiction, from mystery novels that use the disappearance as a starting point for elaborate detective stories, to more literary works that explore themes of knowledge, mystery, and the boundaries between the rational and the inexplicable. Several documentaries have been produced about the case, each attempting to present new evidence or fresh perspectives on the decades-old puzzle. One of the most interesting developments in recent years has been the application of modern technology to the cold case. In 2010, investigators used ground-penetrating radar to search areas around Willowbrook Manor that had been identified as potentially significant by various theories about Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The searches revealed interesting geological features and some historical artifacts, but no evidence related to the missing botanist. Psychological profilers have also examined the case, creating detailed analyses of Dr. Thornfield's personality and behavior patterns in an attempt to understand what might have motivated her actions on that October evening. These studies have confirmed what was apparent to those who knew her. Dr. Thornfield was a stable, methodical person with no apparent psychological issues that would predispose her to sudden, irrational behavior. The psychological profiles have actually made the mystery more puzzling rather than less so, as they confirm that Dr. Thornfield was exactly the kind of person who would not disappear voluntarily without leaving some explanation or making some arrangement for her ongoing responsibilities. Internet forums and social media groups dedicated to unsolved mysteries have kept the Thornfield case alive in popular culture, with new theories and speculations appearing regularly. Some of these online discussions have produced interesting research and occasionally uncover historical details that were previously unknown, though none have provided breakthrough insights into the central mystery. The case has also attracted the attention of paranormal investigators and researchers interested in unexplained phenomena. Several television programs have featured Willowbrook Manor, often focusing on reports of strange occurrences that residents and visitors have experienced since Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Dr. Edmund Thornfield, now in his final years, has remained remarkably patient with the continuing attention that the mystery has brought to his family's ancestral home. He has cooperated with serious investigators while tactfully discouraging sensationalistic approaches to the case. In recent interviews, he has expressed hope that someday the mystery will be resolved, though he acknowledges that this seems increasingly unlikely as the years pass. "My family has owned this manor for nearly 3 centuries, Dr. Edmund Thornfield said in a 2012 interview. "We've seen births and deaths, celebrations and tragedies, the ordinary events that make up human life. But Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance is unlike anything else in our history. It's as if the manor itself has been touched by something beyond normal experience." The current residents of Willowbrook Manor scholars who continue to pursue their research in the institution that Dr. Thornfield helped to establish live with the daily reminder of the unsolved mystery. Dr. Thornfield's study remains preserved as it was found, but the rest of the residential facility continues to function as she would have wanted, providing a peaceful environment for academic work and intellectual exploration. Some residents report feeling Dr. Thornfield's presence in positive ways, a sense that her dedication to scholarly pursuit continues to inspire the manor's academic mission. Others find the mystery unsettling and prefer not to discuss it. All acknowledge that the case has become an integral part of the manor's identity, as much a part of its character as the ancient stone walls and carefully tended gardens. Recent visitors to Willowbrook Manor often comment on the strange duality of the place. During the day, it functions as a productive research institution, with scholars pursuing their various projects in an atmosphere of quiet concentration. But in the evenings, when shadows lengthen across the gardens and lights begin to appear in windows, the manor takes on a more mysterious character, and thoughts inevitably turn to the woman who vanished without a trace. On a similar autumn evening decades ago, the Memorial Garden, established in Dr. Thornfield's honor, has become a place of reflection for many visitors. The medicinal plants she studied continue to grow and flourish, following their ancient cycles of growth, flowering, and rest. The stone bench bears the marks of weather and time, but the inscription remains clear, a simple acknowledgement of a life dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. As this account draws to a close, it's important to acknowledge that the mystery of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance remains exactly that, a mystery. Despite decades of investigation, speculation, and analysis, we are no closer to understanding what happened on that October evening in 1987 than Inspector Chenley was on the morning he first arrived at Willowbrook Manor. The facts of the case are well established and have been verified countless times. Dr. Thornfield was a respected botanist who lived a quiet, scholarly life at a residential research facility. On the evening of October 3, 1987, she was working in her locked study on the second floor of the manor. By morning, she had vanished completely, leaving behind her interrupted work, her untouched tea, and a locked room that showed no signs of how she might have departed. The theories that have been proposed to explain her disappearance range from the mundane to the extraordinary, but none have provided a completely satisfying answer to the central puzzle. Each theory can account for some aspects of the mystery while leaving others unexplained. Each offers a possible solution while raising new questions. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to remain, as reminders that the world contains depths that we do not fully understand. Perhaps Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance belongs to that category of human experiences that exist at the boundary between the known and the unknowable, challenging our assumptions about the nature of reality itself. What we can say with certainty is that Dr. Thornfield's legacy extends far beyond the mystery of her disappearance. Her scholarly work continues to influence research into traditional plant knowledge. her approach to combining scientific rigor with respect for indigenous wisdom has become a model for ethnobotanical studies, and her dedication to preserving ancient knowledge for future generations has inspired countless other researchers that the encyclopedia she was so close to completing, when she vanished, has become a standard reference work consulted by botanists, historians, and herbalists around the world. In that sense, Dr. Thornfield achieved her goal of preserving traditional plant knowledge for future generations, even though she was not able to witness the completion of her life's work. Asterisk. Visitors to Willowbrook Manor today can walk the same garden paths that Dr. Thornfield traversed every morning for over 3 years. They can see many of the plants she studied growing in the same soil that nurtured her research. They can visit her preserved study, where her interrupted work serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of human plans and the persistence of unsolved mysteries. The manor continues to fulfill its mission as a place of scholarly retreat and research, welcoming academics from around the world who come to pursue their own intellectual interests in the peaceful Yorkshire countryside. Some come specifically because of their interest in Dr. Thornfield's case, hoping to find some overlooked clue or to gain new insights into the mystery. Others come simply to work in the quiet, contemplative atmosphere that she helped to establish. Asterisk. As autumn returns each year to the Yorkshire Dales, as the leaves change color and the first frost touches the garden paths, those who know the story inevitably think of Dr. Margaret Thornfield and wonder what became of her on that October evening. So many years ago, did she step through some doorway between worlds, as the more fantastic theories suggest? Did she suffer some accident or medical emergency that we have simply failed to discover? Or did she choose to leave her former life behind for reasons that remain known only to herself? The truth is that we may never know. The mystery that began with a failure to appear for breakfast has become something larger than the sum of its facts, a modern legend that continues to capture imaginations and challenge assumptions about the boundaries of the possible. Asterisk. And so, as the gentle rain continues to fall on Willowbrook Manor, as the wind whispers through the ancient oak trees, and as the lights in the manor windows cast their warm glow across the darkened gardens, the mystery of Dr. Margaret Thornfield remains unsolved. Her story has become part of the manor's history, woven into its character as surely as the ivy that climbs its stone walls. Perhaps that is the most fitting tribute to a woman who devoted her life to the study of mysteries, that she should herself become a mystery, one that continues to intrigue and inspire those who encounter it. In a world where so many questions have ready answers, where science and technology seem to explain everything, perhaps we need mysteries like Dr. Thornfield's disappearance to remind us that wonder and uncertainty still have their place in human experience. Asterisk. The case files remain open, the theories continue to proliferate, and the memorial garden grows and changes with each passing season. But Dr. Margaret Thornfield herself remains where she has been for over 3 decades now, somewhere beyond our understanding, in that realm where mysteries reside when they choose not to reveal their secrets. And perhaps, on quiet autumn evenings, when the mist rises from the manor's pond and the shadows grow long across the gardens, perhaps she still walks among the plants she loved, continuing her research in ways that we cannot fathom, pursuing the ancient wisdom that she spent her lifetime trying to preserve and understand. The mystery of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's disappearance from Willowbrook Manor remains unsolved, a puzzle that bridges the gap between the rational and the inexplicable, a reminder that even in our modern world, some questions may forever remain unanswered. Final gentle notes of wind chimes, rain, fading to silence, and so ends our tale for tonight. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of autumn gardens and ancient wisdom, of scholarly dedication and enduring mysteries. Perhaps you'll walk the paths of Willowbrook Manor in your dreams, searching for answers that may never come, but finding peace in the knowledge that some mysteries are beautiful precisely because they remain unsolved. Sleep well. And may your dreams be filled with the gentle mystery of Dr. Margaret Thornfield's story, a tale that reminds us that the world still holds secrets, and that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in answers, but in questions that continue to echo through time.